the worship of blood. Well, I can understand young kids taking a fly at it just for kicks, but we're talking about sophisticated, mature adults.
It isn't unique. The notorious Hellfire Club of the 18th century was comprised solely of the elite brains of this country. The wisest men of Asia were firmly convinced that human blood was the elixir of youth. And those who adhere to the cult of vampirism are usually sophisticated, mature adults. These are the people who fully realize its tremendous potential. And one of these men could be the motivating force, the menace, and the power.
Are these men involved in this whole business because they're under some kind of threat? Or drugs?
Or hypnosis. This particular evil is more potent and more addictive than heroin, I assure you. And the end result is just as fatal.
It's Friday, it's 5 o'clock. Welcome to Not the BCfm Politics Show on Friday the 31st of March 2023, streaming live from the PRSC Arts Centre in Bristol and on the talkradio.org.uk stream, at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey, and live on the Not the BCfm Politics Show app, available free from all good app stores, anything but Google, please. I'm Tony Gosling. Thank you for turning off the psycho in the corner, gaslighting us with its military-grade, psychological warfare propaganda, not just pushing an economic war on the British people, but a war on the superpower, the nuclear-armed superpower Russia too. The Dark Enlightenment zombies waging war on the British people now, as well as Putin. So this, what you're listening to now, is what the BBC might sound like were it free of the tentacles of the authoritarian deep state Zionist lobbies. So navigating us through the Fourth Reich matrix, or the World Economic Forum's Fourth Industrial Revolution, is Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers. A couple of things from this week. Royal Mail apparently is about to go bankrupt, even though it's making record profits, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. We've got a bit of a special with the Bristol boaters who are being hiked. Their rents are being hiked, the mooring fees by up to 350% by our wonderful Bristol Labour Mayor, who's said that rent controls are needed. Well, rent controls are needed on him. And they are just launching a crowd justice campaign. They've got a lawyer in order to really push back against these appalling rent increases and the attempt to socially cleanse Bristol Harbour. And we'll also be looking with freelance journalist Joanna Booth at the missing £3 million from the Harbour budget over the last 7 years. Where has that money disappeared to? Also, of course, at the France protests in part 2. We'll be listening to Catherine Austin-Fitz giving us a complete banking analysis on what's going on in the banking sector right now, what their bigger game plan is, so how what's happening at the moment fits in to the bigger plan. Dr. Chris Busby, interviewed by Sputnik this week, behind the firewall that is, but no, it's on the show tonight. Got a copy of the interview that the Russians have done with him about depleted uranium from Bideford, which is where he lives, down in Devon, or North Devon coast, and also looking at the relationship between the way that Chris Busby, even though he's working for the British military on nuclear safety, was cancelled by a certain George Monbiot in The Guardian, the way that his funding and his credibility was destroyed by just a few Guardian articles and smears against him by George Monbiot. And also, of course, you can't miss Scott Ritter talking about, well, we heard from Jeffrey Sachs last week, didn't we, that actually the war in Ukraine is really about China. Very interesting take from him. And so Scott Ritter is talking tonight about Taiwan and what's going on with the Chinese. Finally, David Livingstone talking about the Order of the Nine Angles. This is the Global Death Cult, the book which we reviewed a couple of months ago now. But Livingstone's really interesting, I think, on looking at this organisation, which is basically a kind of satanic death squad, and the way they actually organise. What are their real beliefs? So whenever you see some unexplained death, maybe it's them. Who knows? Possibly this Nashville shooting, or these Christian tots murdered by a gunman this week. So Iranian and Russian news banned in the UK, first by the telecoms cartel, then a few days later by Ofcom. The cart being before the horse, of course, in that case, as in many other cases. The big corporations are just running the show, and the regulators just follow along afterwards. And we're also cancelled, of course, off Bristol Community FM by the Bristol Mafia, but not cancelled here yet. So, Martin, is there anything you'd like to say? We will be talking about France a little bit later, but, I mean, for me, this has been absolutely amazing to watch, the incredible extent to which the French people have been coming out week after week now. Actually, the Israelis too, haven't they? The Israelis, ever since Christmas, there seems to be some, in both those two countries, something happening with people power.
Well, they're not necessarily directly comparable because the issues are different. In France, I think the problem has been that by forcing it through the National Assembly without a vote, Macron has actually motivated many people to oppose him who are sitting on the sidelines.
But in a way, aren't the issues the same? Because it's about dictatorship, isn't it? About authoritarian power.
In a sense, you could say it's the same, because what you've got is an established government that wants to do something and a lot of people who don't want them to do it. But, there's obviously quite a lot of differences in the two situations, not least, of course, because Israel is in occupation of Palestine and the Palestinians have taken no part in the protests in Israel because they don't see it as any relevance to their well-being at all. So that's a completely, there isn't. You could argue that you've got a similar underclass in France. The Muslim youth from the banlieue have not really participated in these protests. They tend to have their own agenda. So in a sense, you could say there's some kind of parallel there. But I don't think it's terribly helpful if we just see everything as all part of one big thing and it's all the same stuff. I mean, surely we need to pass it out a bit better than that.
Yeah, fine. But it does seem as if there isn't even an attempt to pretend that there's a democracy in either of those two countries anymore.
No, there is an attempt to pretend. Of course there is.
Well, okay, so how can Macron...
there just isn't one.
Well, okay, but how can Macron attempt to pretend that what he's doing is democratic when he quite clearly he's had to use this kind of kingly power, which is obviously what it flies in the face of the whole tradition of France ever since the revolution.
Well, no, it doesn't, because France has always been a very contested political space. Don't forget the Fifth Republic, under which the current constitution in France was only brought in 1958 by referendum on the back of a military coup against the elected government, which was a socialist government of that time. So, in actual fact, France is a rather unstable place where people on different sides of the fence don't necessarily accept the rules of the game, which is why you have these kind of fairly full-on confrontations. Less so in this country, especially in England, where the tradition is that we put up with anything really, but not so much in Ireland, for example, where people tend to pick up rifles and machine guns and bombs and so forth.
Okay, well, let's start here in Bristol, though, where we also have a slight problem with a despotic mayor. The population here in the city voted last year to get rid of the whole mayor position, but he had 2 years to run still. We're waiting, looking at our watches. When is he going? He's still causing all sorts of trouble, and there is this attempt to gentrify the city centre by getting rid of the people who are living in the Harbour and they had this amazing thing. I mean, Martin, how can you explain this from a Labour Party point of view, where you've got a vote 1 week in January at the City Council saying we must stop landlords putting up rents so much, we need some sort of rent control system in the city, even though it was ineffective because they didn't have any power to do it. And then the next week, the mayor decides for himself to put up the rent of the boaters who live in Bristol city centre up to 350%. I mean, it just seems as if they're not even... there's no joined-up thinking, and it certainly isn't in any way socialist or, for the workers at all. It's just for the property developers, and the idea is that, well, you've got people who've bought £500,000, £1 million flats here, and they don't want scuzzy people living in boats anywhere near them.
Well, I think you did see a democratic pushback in the sense that when the Hot Wells by-election took place, the Labour Party's vote rent was very much down, and the Greens took the seat. And many of the people in Hot Wells were unhappy with two decisions. One was the attempt to sell off the library to the Cathedral School, because many people in Hot Wells use that library, the central library, and the other one was the attempted removal of the boat people, if we can call them that. So, he's out, obviously, the mayor is out of touch with opinion in that particular part of Bristol. But,
Look, Martin, you're missing something quite important here. And it's like Macron. They're on the way out. Neither of these people are going to be standing another term either as a French president or as mayor of Bristol. So they're thinking, well, I may as well just do this and that.
I understand it, Tony. Marvin Rees is thinking of being a Labour Party candidate for Bristol North West. He's definitely politicking to be chosen as that candidate, so he intends to carry on being a political figure within Bristol. So, he's not just disappearing somewhere. Macron, it will have to disappear because it's a two-term rule. But Marvin, whatever you may think of him, is not going to disappear from Bristol. It's most unlikely. I think if he is chosen as the candidate, it's likely that he will win. So you're going to find him not disappearing, Tony, I'm afraid.
Well, we shall see. Because,
from your point of view.
It depends what he does over the next year, doesn't it?
It does. But don't forget, people in Hot Wells won't be voting in Bristol North West, so he doesn't have to worry about what they think for sure.
It might well be he's that cynical that he's thinking, well, these people aren't going to find out what I'm up to in other parts of the city. Interesting. Anyway, Mandy Sharman as the chair of the Bristol Boaters Group, and she's one of the people who they have now launched this legal challenge. They've got a lawyer, and they've got a crowdfunding web page up there, Crowd Justice. But let's just hear one of the things I find so fascinating about this is when you actually talk to people that live in boats, you realise that actually having someone living, this is a little bit like, Martin, I'm sure you can remember from squatting days, when you've got a whole row of houses that have been left empty and derelict for a while, it attracts all sorts of problems, crime, etc. When there's someone actually living there, it makes a wealth of difference, doesn't it?
Well, yes, it can do.
And the alternative here in Bristol is, you can have a row of 500 luxury yachts with nobody actually living in them.
Well, I take the point about gentrification. Of course, that is, but don't forget the whole of Bristol is being gentrified, but whether Marvin Rees was the mayor or not...
No, this is the mayor doing it.
Well, this is the mayor facilitating it, but it would happen anyway, because that's the way our society functions.
Doing it. He's saying this is the increase in the mooring fees, 350%. Anyway, let's have a listen to Mandy Sharman now, and there's a longer piece I'll put up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk as part of their crowdfunding campaign about the reason why it's actually quite important to have people living in the harbour rather than just a whole load of empty luxury yachts.
They're claiming now that as a harbour authority they're not legally bound to consult, but they have promised time and time again as part of the harbour review there was going to be a thorough consultation. That's the whole reason why we formed. We wouldn't have the association if it wasn't for this review and this proposed consultation. So it's really disappointing that we've got to this point. It's never what I dreamed would happen. I thought we were going to be fully engaged in a consultation and this was going to revitalise the whole area, and just more and more now I'm feeling like the people on the boats and the businesses here are just not a valued part of the harbour. And it's just really sour. It's really sour, and I'm really sad that it's got to this position. But we've fought to try and get some sort of engagement and communication going on with the harbour. So we've launched a campaign. So off the back of our petition, we have launched a crowd justice appeal to try and raise some funds for our legal fight, really. So we just really want the council to engage in the consultation that they've promised, and we'd love the fees to be reasonable. We don't think that they can just make up fees based on other marinas and markets around the country. It would be nice if the fees were not against fee increases, but they have to be reasonable and they have to be with enough notice. And if only they consulted with their people, they would have half a chance of understanding and better knowing these waters, because I think the users have always got that inside information that the managers or the people above don't necessarily have a sight on.
And here she is talking about the, amongst other things, some of the antisocial behaviour that goes on around the harbour and what the boaters are actually doing to help sort it out.
This strategy of increasing the fees without including its people, it's going to push out those that can't afford it or those that aren't sort of strong enough to stand together. And we're going to be left with vessel owners, which the vessel is their second home or their toy on the weekend, rather than the people that are here, which are using their boats as their primary accommodation.
If you look around some of these marinas, you think, well, someone is so wealthy they've even forgotten that they've got a boat.
And they rarely use their vessels, just when the sun's shining. Or on the bank holiday weekend, whereas the people that we've got on the boats in the harbour are here day in, day out, and it's that that element of security all around the quayside as well, that you've got people on boats. Just before Christmas, we had a lot of antisocial behaviour in Redcliffe along Merchants Landing, where the houses and the vessels were being targeted for like 2 weeks. And the first people out are the ones that are staying on board. Yeah, and everyone really pulled together over that time. Lots of the commercial vessels were trashed and the private vessels, and the houses had their windows broken in for 2 weeks. And everyone sort of pulls together. But if those vessels were just dormant, then they would have been completely trashed. There wouldn't have been people on the edge of the quayside able to sort of deal with these problems.
Joanne, there is an element of almost social cleansing going on here. It's going to completely change, if the council get their way, completely change the character of the harbour.
Yes, definitely. And it's gentrification. I mean, it's inequality in terms of, you know, physical land. That's what's happening here, and it's part of a strategy that the whole harbour side is being changed, and we can also see it in the expanse of the licences for premises, for alcohol-bearing premises around the harbour side, the way that residents are being kind of pushed out and prioritising nightclubs and establishments. We have a nighttime economy advisor now. Part of it is kind of a nighttime tsar, the same way they have in London, they have in Manchester. And that's all part of this programme, you know, being pushed by a consultancy called Sound Diplomacy and also supported by L&G. L&G are very much...
Legal in general.
Legal in general, yes. Kind of insurance company, but they also do housing. They're involved in Temple Island. And they're also involved in kind of the promotion of city centre regeneration. And for us, city centre is very much part of the harbour. So it's an extension of it. What you see in the harbour, that gentrification, is the same thing you see with the boats, trying to push residents out in favour of leisure economies.
Well, we in St Paul's call it the nightmare economy, because actually what's been going on is quite a lot of new venues have been opening up, making a lot of noise. I mean, particularly, finding it where people come out of the venues to smoke, and in the summer evenings it can be really difficult to get, when you've got licences up to 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. This is the commercialisation of areas where people need to live, and I think the same seems to be happening in the harbour.
Oh, definitely. And if you look just down, kind of the next street past the harbour, down in Millennium Promenade, one of the buildings has tried to kind of limit residents going through. They've tried to fence it off, saying this is private route. And that's fine for them if they can do it, but opposite there is social housing. So when this area was set up, not even that long ago, it was, under Labour, just after 2000, it was a 130 million project to create all these residences and all these big buildings. And it was meant to be for residents. It was the idea was to bring in residential. There are 3 schools around here, 3 primary schools, Hotwell, St George and Cathedral. You know, it wasn't intended for what they're doing now. The change in this area has been kind of permeating the whole place. And that's very much what we're seeing. And part of it is looking at also who's involved in the plans for this. There's a city centre strategic forum with the University of Bristol involved, Merchant Venturers, Business West, Marty Burgess from Lakota, and it's these kind of nightclubs and property developers that are leading the strategy. And
that's not what I'm saying. Is that's not what local authorities, city councils are supposed to do. They're collecting taxes. And what they're supposed to be doing with that is to be pushing back against some of these purely commercial interests. Surely, they seem to have got it all back to front.
They do. I think the local authorities very much feel like they've been captured by kind of property interests and nighttime economy interests, and that's why we're seeing these policies now. The kind of residents are being pushed aside, and commercial enterprises are being prioritised.
So that's Bristol blogger Joanne Booth, and she does a lot of freedom of information requests, and she's a prolific Twitterer. And before that, you heard Mandy Sharma from the Bristol Boaters Association. Martin, and what they're describing there, there are all these announcements from the council. Oh, we're going to make the docks more commercial, the harbour, it's all going to be wonderful. When you hear about what's happening on the ground, actually what's happening is people who aren't wealthy are being totally pushed out, small businesses are being pushed out, and the nightclubs and the luxury yachts are moving in.
Yeah, I mean, this process is being facilitated by the council, but it would be probably going on anyway, because local authorities have had their budgets slashed to pieces.
Okay, well, those people living in the harbour have been there for decades.
Yes, I know.
You know, so, hundreds of years. So people have been living in there for a very long time, whilst the council has been, you know, you're saying this is an inevitability to this.
I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm just pointing out that underlying all of this, the creation of elected mayors, the removal of the central support grants for local authorities. Local authorities used to be primarily funded on central government distributed grants, which were distributed on the basis of need. In other words, certain places would get more because they were poorer. That's all gone. So what you've got is you've got elected mayors who no longer get central government money, so they're under pressure to agree to commercial development because they're going to get the business rate money back to the council, which then allows them to do stuff for people to get re-elected.
It's also that there isn't any say for the people in what's going on. It's,
that's right.
She's describing the city centre.
Money doesn't talk, it swears at local and national level.
Centre Strategy Forum. She listed the members of it. We're talking basically about the Merchant Venturers, Business West, and Marty from the Lakota nightclub, who is also a merchant venturer. So this is merchant venturer policy that's being implemented all across the harbour.
Yes, and of course the alliance between an elected mayor and these business interests is because this was designed by the Tories when Cameron was in power, that local authorities will be forced.
We voted for a Labour mayor.
And that, but of course Marvin Rees is a Labour mayor, but he's also an elected mayor, and they're all trapped in this. Andy Burnham's trapped in the same thing in Manchester. They're all trapped in it. So what they've got to do in order to get re-elected is they need to get in bed with the property developers so they can get the business rate, so they can then pursue their pet projects.
Well, there was
all of which is very pro-business.
Yeah, BBC,
which is why the Tories brought it in.
BBC Question Time last night. Sorry, folks, I haven't got the clip, but it was from Bristol, and there was a terrific contribution by one of the audience. I mean, it always seems to me the audience are the ones that come up with the really good stuff. You get maybe one or two contributions. Bob Crow, people like that come to mind, you know, on the panel of Question Time. Martin, I'm sure you'd have some good contributions if you were sitting on the panel of Question Time, and maybe that's why you're not, because that's not, you'd be up against the presenter of Antiques Roadshow, who's now the chair, unbelievably. But they were making the point that actually a lot of this antisocial behaviour we were hearing about from Mandy just there is caused by the withdrawal of services by local authorities because of the coalition governments from 2010, the Cameron governments and successive Tory governments' cuts to local authorities.
Well, that's right. So things like youth clubs have gone by the board years ago. And then you wonder why people are wandering around, in gangs trying to break into things.
But it is kind of worse than that. I mean, obviously the commercial interests must be rubbing their hands and laughing at people like Marvin Rees, because as Joanne Booth points out here, I mean, we've had the £50 million down the drain Bristol Energy scandal, which the Bristol Mayor Marvin Rees just failed to deal with for 4.5 years before they realised, OK, well, this is just going to be money down the drain. It's not going anywhere. We've also got some serious problems with the I think it's called Gorham Homes, the so-called council house building company. We've got massive problems with the affordable housing policy, because there's lots of houses being built, but they're not affordable. The big affordable project, championed by Bristol Mayor Marvin Rees, there's a whole load of subsidence underneath it, and it looks like it's slipping into the River Avon up on the Bath Road. There are also problems with Bristol Waste, which it looks as if may also be going bankrupt. These are these arm's length companies that they've set up, disaster after disaster. And now we hear from Joanna Booth that the Harbour too. She thinks that over the last 6 or 7 years, around about £3 million has disappeared out of the Harbour budgets. So it's been spent, but no one can find anything that it's actually been spent on. So she's doing some freedom of information requests at the moment to find out where that £3 million has gone.
They've been looking at the harbour since Marvin Rees, the current mayor of Bristol, actually came into power. So in 17-18, that year, they were going to spend £1.6 million just on maintenance of the harbour. Then in 2019, when Penny Fell, the new director of commercialisation, started on board, she had some new ideas, and then they agreed to spend another nearly £1 million, £885,000, that year to fix the harbour. Then The following.
Sorry, but how was this money spent? Was it spent on these consultants, or was it spent on doing things?
Yeah, well, that's exactly that's the question, because then by the following year, 2020, this has been 4 years into Teresa's administration, they had they said they were going to provide a harbour review to see how the money has been spent, to see what they were going to do and how they were going to move forward. Well, that failed to be completed by the time it was supposed to, so they outsourced it to a consultancy for £130,000. And that was due to be published in October 22, a few months ago. No one's seen it. I still don't know if it has been published, but over that time, £3 million has been spent on the harbour since 2017. And the latest price increase doesn't seem to follow from anything actually being published. We don't know what the review said. It's not public. We don't know what they're proposing, how much money is in this harbour, in this harbour pot, and we don't know what they're doing.
So who's this, did you say her name was Penny Fell? Who is this person? Because it sounds to me as if they're the kind of key person, but she's not around anymore.
She's not around anymore. She was actually in charge of the harbour when Colston statue fell, and she was part of the kind of plan to get it out of there. But she was also responsible for signing off the Bristol Energy Company accounts 7 days before the company was found to be insolvent. And then that following summer, she left quietly.
I mean, just give us an idea, if you can, Joanne, of the backdrop of the way that the City Council is run now, because we've got this mayor system with George Ferguson to begin with. He was quite inclusive. He tried to include all the, existing parties, the Lib Dems, the Greens, Labour, Conservative, on his cabinet. But since Marvin Rees, the Labour mayor's taken over, things have changed, haven't they? And the mayor has got a lot of power, it seems, almost like a US-style mayor.
He does. He has executive power. I mean, the only two things he doesn't really control entirely are licensing and planning. But even there, we've seen from FOIs that behind the scenes, the mayor's assistant and the mayor try to control what the planners do. So when an application fails, the planning officers, apologise to Marvin. And there's a major projects spreadsheet where they keep track of all the things that they want to push through, like St Mary Laporte development, also the Empire Fighting Chance boxing club is on there, the one that the mayor gifted the land of to his own boxing club, Empire Fighting Chance. But what's interesting about the harbour at the moment is the consultation that didn't take place before fees were hiked. So we had a very similar situation in the Western Harbour, a new project that's meant to have 3,000 homes built just past the harbour, Cumberland Basin, and they said they were going to do an engagement rather consultation. Consultation is an actual process that can be taken to judicial review if it's not done properly. But this was a smaller engagement, which had 2,600 responses. But that was ignored. So the following year, they spent £150,000 with a group to do another consultation process, which wasn't actually a consultation, which had included things like plasticine workshops and people coming from other places. I don't know. They even gave vouchers to people from Lawrence Weston to come and comment on the Western Harbour, and they had meetings with the elders of Easton. Another way of not holding a consultation. So they've now gone forth with trying to get money for a master plan for the Western Harbour without actually having a consultation, promising one after the fact.
So amazing, really, that there seems to be... Well, so, they've decided they can just tear up the rule book and do it however they want, Martin. There's no need to actually follow the law. But we'll see with this crowdfunding. It looks as if the Bristol boaters are holding the City Council's nose to the fire, if I can say that. What they're saying is, look, you've decided to do it this way, but that's unlawful, and we think you should do it this way. Let's see what the courts say.
Well, if they've got, if they've got a legal case, then they can pursue it.
They're acting as if they're running a business, aren't they? This is the way businesses operate. They've got a strategic board, handpicked by the mayor, that decides everything, and then it looks for a way that it can wangle to get what it wants without doing a proper consultation.
That was the whole concept of having elected mayors in the first place. If you remember, it was a back of a fag packet idea, but from Conservative Central Office. Why don't we do it like they do in America? And of course, if you remember back in the day when we had non-elected, there was not an elected mayor. They had Lord Mayors, and we had a committee system. but power in Bristol seesawed between the Lib Dems and the Labour Party, and of course, because we didn't have all-out elections, every year there would be elections in some wards and not in others, so the balance of power was constantly being contested. And of course, from the business point of view, they just want quick decisions to do the stuff they want to do. So the whole thing of having elected mayors, that was the conception by the Tories, because this is their idea. Labour Party have bought into it, but originally it was their idea, is so that they can just bulldoze stuff through. And don't forget, that was Ferguson's idea as well. Once he's an elected mayor, and he pushed for elected mayors, he can get stuff done. And that's the whole point about it, getting stuff done,
Martin,
so we don't have to consult, we just get stuff done.
There's a million miles from what's going on with the Bristol voters, because Ferguson did consultations on everything.
Yeah, but it's up to
and
him.
what they've decided...
It's up to him. He could have decided to overrule everybody.
Well, no, you've got to do a consultation, otherwise you're up for a legal challenge.
Well,
and that means that the council...
That's the law,
the council is not only going to not get what it wants, it's also going to have to pay a massive legal bill, potentially.
Well, that may be the case. I mean, obviously, I haven't looked into
this. This is the way private businesses operate.
Yes, well, I guess
the chances.
Well, this is the whole.
The banks, for example, saying, "Well, actually, we don't care about the courts because if it does go to court, it's only going to cost us a few bob, and we've made however many billion out of our fraud in the first place."
Well, yeah, but don't forget that the conservative conception of what democratic politics is it should be run like a business. Rishi Sunak is trying to run...
No, Labour, surely.
Well, yes, but Labour have bought into this, but it was originally the conservative concept of having elected mayors wasn't a Labour concept.
It was
their concept.
It was a Lib Dem Tory thing,
yes,
wasn't it?
It was actually a Tory thing, and the Lib Dems went along with it. Now, in other words, the whole purpose
Wasn't it an American thing, really?
Well, that's right. It's an American-style setup where some guy who's the chief, we want somebody in charge, General Patton, whoever it is,
the Tories
they just make the decisions.
The Tories in Bristol are now its most vociferous opponents.
Well, I know, but it's a bit rich considering they were the ones who rammed it down our throat in the first place.
Certainly right. Man vows to never return to Bristol after a clean air zone finds on a visit to his sick granddaughter. This is on the ITV West News. A man has vowed never to return to Bristol after being hit with a series of clean air zone fines while visiting his sick newborn granddaughter. Alan Stubbington was travelling through the city to visit his seriously ill 12-week-old granddaughter when he entered a fee-paying zone. This is the first time Bristol City in Bristol City Centre, and he was trying to follow his sat-nav, avoid bus lanes and read road signs. He did spot a few green zone signs, but didn't realise these meant he had to pay anything. As a new visitor to the city, I won't be returning, and I won't be recommending it to anyone else to visit. I was concentrating on the roads. My car's green enough to not have to pay the road tax even, so I assume, of course, that it was an emission-friendly car. There is a succession of stories like this now of people who are getting ensnared in this. It's the carrot and the stick. This is very much the stick, isn't it? That if you've got a polluting car. But as we showed back at the end of last year with Michael Bond's report, actually, they don't need to have a clean air zone. They're under no obligation to do it. And I'm looking forward to the first person that successfully takes Bristol City Council to court by saying, hang on a minute, the government's legal limit is X in nitrogen dioxide, and you've already achieved that, so you don't need a clean air zone, and see what the judges have to say about that. Also, a man using triple the emissions to take a detour around Bristol's clean air zone. And I love this story almost more than any others because it proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that the clean air zone has got nothing to do whatsoever with clean air. 73-year-old from Bristol said he's using 3 times his old emissions to avoid the city's clean air zone. Adrian Knight from Easton drives a 1987 Suzuki, which would clock up a charge of £9 a day if it was to go through Bristol's clean air zone. Instead, when he travels to Bedminster weekly, he uses a route 3 times the length, which he argues is less ecologically friendly. He said that the CAS is not fit for purpose. If it's designed to clean the air, I'm a pensioner and cannot afford a compliant car. Also, it's making the air 3 times more polluted. A tourist as well has vowed to boycott Bristol after being hit with the clean air zone fines. This is a man has vowed never to return to Bristol after being hit with a series of clean air zone fines. It goes on and on, actually. and there was a piece this week on the This Is Money website, which is, I think, part of the Daily Mail. Motorist fears he will now have to sell his home to pay the £4,000 in fines that have been imposed on him after he drove over the period of a month. I mean, this is a little bit expensive, isn't it? £4,000 a month. In order to go into the Bristol's clean air zone. Henry Franklin, 36 years old, drove into Bristol's clean air zone for work between February and March, but he was fined for the trips and fears he will lose everything and to pay the penalty. The 36-year-old does face losing everything now. He must stump up the huge fine and buy a new car that complies with the rules, or else fork out more for fuel on longer gas-guzzling commutes around the zone to avoid the clean air zone. He says, I live paycheck to paycheck. If all these fines are upheld, I'm looking at roughly £4,000 to pay, he said. That will certainly mean I have to sell my car and quit my job. It was almost likely mean I have to sell up and leave Bristol. He added, I was angrily frustrated and tired when I realised I was going to be fined. This new system is confusing for a number of reasons. I can't fathom why they've chosen the area they have for the clean air zone other than to generate lots of fines, Martin. This is a toll, really, isn't it?
Well, obviously the debate about this has gone on, and some people don't like it at all, but many of the people that you've been quoting obviously don't like it. The fundamentals, of course, is that...
Is it about clean air?
It may well not be, because, as I said before, the central government grant to local authorities has been slashed to pieces. So they're now finding other ways to raise revenue, and this is a revenue-raising thing.
So the Bristol Mayor Marvin Rees is a con man when he says this is about the clean air?
He would say he's not. I don't know enough about what the arguments were in favour of it or against it.
Again, it's almost as if, you've got to take the mayor to court, just like the boaters do, in order to get any justice.
Well, if you've got a legal case, then that's the thing to do. But the question is, have you got a legal case, or is he acting within his legal powers?
I certainly think there is a legal case. If you look at the document which Michael Bond produced, and which I helped sort of write up a bit, and I added a few sentences, quotes from various news stories. I mean, it's quite clear from his statistics that there is absolutely no justification, if you look at the nitrogen dioxide levels in the city, to have a clean air zone at all, because we've already achieved the levels of nitrogen dioxide in the air that the government have demanded, and yet they've decided to impose this zone anyway.
Well, if there's a legal case, then they have to take it to court. If there isn't a legal case, the powers of elected mayors were deliberately designed to be overwhelming, because then they can get stuff done. I've never agreed with elected mayors, but there you are. If you've got elected mayors, that's what they do. Maybe we shouldn't have them. We're not going to have them in future in Bristol, are we?
As of May next year, no, we're not. We're going back to the committee system, and I think there's a kind of there's a committee which is looking at the committee system and exactly what sort of committee system to have. Anyway, just looking at Prime Minister's questions this week, we had a rather it was a bit weird, because apparently Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, was going to the former Speaker Betty Boothroyd's funeral, so he didn't turn up. And so this was a kind of a last-minute thing, so there were quite a few questions which were addressed to Sunak, but he wasn't actually there. And standing in for Keir Starmer was Angela Rayner, the Deputy... what is she, Martin?
She's the Deputy Leader of the
Labour Party. Okay, of course she is. Silly me, right. And so here they are talking about the announcement this week about antisocial behaviour. We'll be talking about that, I think. It's a sort of theme running through the show, because the antisocial behaviour, it seems to me, Martin, is just a simple result of a lack of opportunities for young people and the withdrawal of public services due to the massive cuts in the funding of local government. Is that basically it?
Well, that's part of it, and it's also, don't forget that the life expectancy in this country has gone down as a result of austerity, first time in 100 years, and all sorts of pathologies are appearing in the social infrastructure. Just wait till mass unemployment hits amongst young people, and then we'll talk about antisocial behaviour.
Okay, so let's go to Prime Minister's questions now.
Angela Rayner. Madam Deputy Speaker, and welcome back into the chair. And can I share the Deputy Prime Minister's words on our Baroness and our thoughts with her family today? And I'm sure the whole House will join me also in paying tribute to Paul O'Grady after his sad death was announced today. He was a national treasure and a true Northern star, and he will be greatly missed. Madam Deputy Speaker, this week the government announced their so-called anti-social behaviour policy. It's only taken 13 years. And look, I'll give him some credit. The Deputy Prime Minister knows firsthand the misery caused by thugs and their intimidating behaviour, lurking with menace, exploding in fits of rage, creating a culture of fear, and maybe even, I don't know, throwing things. So can I ask him, under his new anti-social behaviour, does he think more bullies will be brought to justice?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can reassure the House I've never called anyone scum. But if the Right Honourable Lady is serious about standing up for communities and people who suffer at the scourge of antisocial behaviour, she'd back our plan to deal more swiftly with these issues, to make sure that we ban drugs beyond the conventional ones, give police the powers they need, and if they really want to protect the public, they'll back our plans for parole reform to make sure the murderers, the terrorists, the child killers are not allowed out free to threaten other people, and reintroduce the ministerial veto that side took away.
That's Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister, standing in for Rishi Sunak. I think she's been actually quite sly there, isn't she? And having a go at him because he is himself being investigated for bullying. Although I'm not so sure there's any real case much against him. I noticed there was a lot of these claims that he was a bully came in just after the British destroyer. I can't remember which one, HMS something or other, which came up to Crimea and tried to sail into Crimea, and the Russians fired a few warning shots across the bows before it turned and went away. And he made a statement at the time saying when he was Foreign Secretary, saying that what the Ministry of Defence was doing was reckless and stupid.
Yes, and
so he's a bit out of favour, maybe.
Well, yes, but I think in any case he has got a reputation. I don't know whether it's true or not, but plenty of people have said
suddenly surfaced
well,
after this.
Suddenly surfaced.
No, it did.
It's not just one allegation against him.
It's not. No, I'm saying
there are a number
these
of different
allegations,
people, civil servants
these
who dealt
allegations
with him, who say he's a bully.
Well, that's right. And so someone was going out. It seems to me maybe MI5 looking for those allegations. I mean, I'm not no great fan of Raab, but I notice this when anyone says anything, which it dares to say anything, which is common sense, like don't sail your destroyer into Russian waters, please, as that will be seen as a provocation, and we don't really want to do that, and we don't want to put sailors' lives at risk, and we don't want to start World War III, that their knuckles are wrapped like Raab's were.
Well, I suspect the two things are not as connected as you suggest, Tony. I think Raab probably is a personal bully. I think he probably was opposed to what you're saying about the destroyer because he's got some spark of common sense. I mean, what a shambles of a government where the Foreign Secretary has no control over whether the British Navy sails a destroyer into a potential war zone. You'd have thought the Foreign Secretary would have something to say about that before it happened.
Yeah, but
never mind commenting on it after it happened.
You know how this works, Martin. No one would have told him.
Well, I'll tell you what's going on is, in actual fact, the deep state runs this country, and in actual fact, the political class are largely window dressing, including Raab, and undoubtedly Angela Rayner has got no power over anything.
You're almost making it sound like theatrics.
Well, it is theatrics, isn't it? A lot of what we're dealing with here is manipulation of public opinion by very powerful forces, and the people you see on the television coming out with stuff aren't the people making the decisions. I was reading this week about John Sawyer, former head of MI6, and he actually made...
John Saws, isn't it? John Saws.
John Saws, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Okay, but anyway, but when he left MI6, he went straight to the board of British Petroleum, which actually pumped millions of pounds worth of oil out of Iraq at the end of the war, and made him a tidy pile. And of course, when we went to war in Iraq 20 years ago, Tony Blair said all the money that was from the oil sales will be put in a trust and used for the Iraqi people. Well, that wasn't the case. BP took a lot of money out of Basra before the British Army run out of Basra by the local boys who were all basically Shias who'd fought Saddam Hussein, and they didn't want the British Army there to kick them out.
And funnily enough, Ofgem, he decided, it's fine, the energy companies can just raise these prices, double their, or triple their, actually, it's not quite that much, is it? Almost double their energy fees. That's fine. So obviously there is this very, very close connection between the deep state, these massive oil companies, the banks,
and the financial sector.
Quite right. Anyway, we had something slightly interesting. I don't think it's that interesting because the new guy that's taken over as First Minister in Scotland is the one that Nicola Sturgeon preferred to take over. She's quite clearly shoddy goods. I think rather the similar that Martin would, you were talking about Jacinda Ardern saying, she's just retiring to spend more time with her family. Would you say the same about Nicola Sturgeon too, or is she actually a busted flush? She's not electable anymore, and so they've got to get rid of her.
No, because in both cases they decided to resign for their own reasons, and their parties were unhappy about it.
They always say that.
Well, of course, Tony, but the election... when is Boris Johnson going to resign? He's still trying to be Prime Minister even now. And of course, him and Liz Truss both sitting in the lobby voting against the Northern Ireland Protocol with their chums in the Ulster Unionist Party. When is he going to resign? Maybe he should resign from Parliament.
Neither Jacinda nor Nicola Sturgeon have resigned as MPs in their respective countries, have they?
They've not resigned as MPs, but they've resigned from leading their party.
She's an MSP, isn't she?
Yes.
But she's not resigned as an MSP.
Okay.
She's just resigned being leader.
Okay. So
like Boris.
You can't presume...
Well, no, Boris was
forced out. He didn't resign. He was voted out.
The idea is that you're about to be forced out, and isn't it better if you resign? It will be better for you.
So maybe Boris should have put that into account.
They've done what they're told. Boris didn't.
Well,
what's
listen,
the difference, really?
Obviously, the political infighting in the Scottish National Party or the New Zealand Labour Party is of interest to anoraks. But it's
Is it going to be good for Labour or the Greens up there? Because they do seem to be really at each other's throats in Scotland, yeah.
Well, I think the ructions within the SNP, because they've been in power in Scotland for quite a long time now, and therefore
they've been losing power.
Well, they've had time to make mistakes and fall out with each other and so on.
They've just got to the stage where they're no longer the largest party. Well, actually, no, they are the largest party, but they don't have a majority.
Well, yeah, right. But at one stage they were the new kids on the block. And now, of course, they've become a bit stale, a bit establishment. They've been in charge for ages.
Like it is. Come on, they've sold out.
No, they haven't.
Yes, they have sold out.
No, well, that's the fight within the SNP is between people who think they have sold out by not going for an illegal referendum, and people who are saying no, they've not sold out. We've got to play it softly.
Well, maybe we can say they've lost their mojo.
Well, the problem is it's quite tricky to do anything politically. Even if you're very, very talented. Like somebody like Putin, for example, you've still got to carry people with you, and it's actually quite tricky. I mean, it's not always straightforward.
A lot of the polls,
you can't just tell people what to think. They've got their own.
There have been polls
idea.
up in Scotland suggesting that maybe trying to push this gender recognition bill and the very embarrassing cases where they've shown, for example, this man that became a woman that was then put in a woman's prison who was a rapist. These sorts of things actually have really gone down like a lead balloon with the Scottish electorate, and that the SNP are suffering. But this guy, the new guy, is it Humza Yusuf? He's basically has the same views on that policy to Nicola Sturgeon. So one does wonder whether they're going to get anywhere with replacing her.
Well, I think the SNP internal election showed that there was very different attitudes about the way forward. Humza Yusuf, as you say, is a continuity candidate with Sturgeon. So what he was saying is things like trans recognition, as they would put it, keeps the Greens on board, which of course keeps the SNP in power in Scotland, because they need the Greens in order to form a government, because it's a proportional system up there.
So it may actually have been the Greens that kind of decided
well,
this.
Well, that's right. So in other words, the Greens hold the balance of power. So if that's what they want, then that's what they're going to get. I think, on balance, it was a very bad policy to go to the wire for, because it's just so controversial. Yeah. Some people are going to agree with it, and some people are going to be passionately against it. Yeah. I'm not a member of the SNP, and therefore, their internal travails are for them to resolve, aren't they? But you can see, in a general sense, look at Netanyahu in Israel. We were talking about that earlier, or Macron in France. Politics is messy and very difficult to conduct.
Well, I think it's getting more messy as the parties seem to be being more and more beholden to their funders and to finance capitalism. There seems to be so I was having a chat with, I won't mention the person's name, recently, to someone who's in a position to know about what's going on in government in Westminster. The suggestion is that actually the Conservatives don't want to win the next general election. They'd rather hand it over to Labour because they think the economy is going to hell in a handbasket, and they're rather a Gordon Brown type situation where the Labour Party have to deal with it rather than them.
I can imagine that's quite a lot of thoughts. I can imagine that they would think like that, yeah. But of course they're not openly going to say that, even those who do think like that. So
you look at things like the Scottish Nationals and you think, well, actually they don't seem to really want to win. What they're doing here is they're not refreshing the leadership, they're just having another leader that has a similar faults.
He didn't win a massive overwhelming majority. He only just squeaked home. And you've got, I've forgotten the name of the woman who was standing against him. She's very much opposed to the
Ash Regan, is it?
Yeah, I think, yeah. And she's quite a conservative Presbyterian background, you see. And of course, but what we've now got, as I was reading earlier, we've now got a Muslim leading the Scottish National Party and a Hindu leading the British Conservative Party, and they're going to row about whether we're going to have a referendum on independence for Scotland. It's, in a way, it just shows
it's quite internationalist, isn't it?
Yeah, this country...
The globalists must be rubbing their hands going, look at Britain. They thought they were going to have Brexit, now they've got globalism.
Well, I mean, the point is that Britain has always been an international place. It has been since forever.
But it doesn't necessarily make sense to have... It doesn't, Martin, it doesn't necessarily make sense for a political party to choose an ethnic minority as a person as their leader. I mean, the idea is that you want to try and capture the hearts and minds of the population who aren't of this ethnic group, yes, and maybe not the same religion either.
Well, exactly. But I mean, the point is,
do they really want to win?
What's actually happening is that people are less bothered about people's ethnic background and more interested in what their policies are, which is good. I mean, that's where we should be.
Well, that's right.
We shouldn't be going on about what colour people are or their religion and say, well, what's your policies?
Yeah, well, maybe the policies are no different to the awful policies before, are they?
Well, I mean,
it'd be nice if it was a refresh, but this doesn't seem to be that at all.
Right, well, we shall see. There's going to be elections in May in Scotland. Yeah. There's going to be elections in Northern Ireland. There's going to be elections all over the country, not in Bristol. And the lie of the land will be clearer after that. Even though perhaps only a third of the population will participate in these elections, it'll be higher in Northern Ireland and in Scotland because it's a bit more at stake. But it gives you an idea of the direction of travel of public opinion.
With the new leader on Monday, Humza Yousaf of the Scottish Nationals, that means a new representative for the SNP at Westminster.
Murray Black.
Wait.
During a cost of living crisis, as his colleagues eye up barrels of cash from fake companies, it's the people across these aisles that are being led by donkeys and they're sitting on Now, the former health secretary also said that he would impart his wisdom for £1,500 an hour. Most nurses earn little above £15 an hour. Who does the Deputy Prime Minister think's best value for money and for the public?
Well, I'm delighted that the majority of the health unions have accepted the pay settlement. We think that that's absolutely right. And she raises the issue, and of course we've worked with on a cross-party basis to curb the limits on second earnings. I notice the benches on this side are curiously quiet. Is that because there's 10 shadow cabinet members on their benches who are taking earnings? In particular, the shadow foreign secretary looks like he certainly doesn't want to be under the limelight. He's got earned second earnings from 40 different sources. I don't think they can talk about it. And as far as the Honourable Lady is concerned, we've done everything we can to make sure there's transparency and accountability.
So, you've effectively got this. So this is a sting which was against a couple of Tory ex-ministers, I think, or maybe even a serving minister. I'm not even sure who it was. But, I mean, they're saying £1,500 an hour. I mean, I wasn't particularly impressed. I would like to have seen, if it was one of the top people agreeing to do something which was illegal or something, that would be fine. That was good. But this is all legal stuff. These MPs are allowed to take this money for helping with access and this kind of thing. That's within the law. But the point is that you do seem to have now an understanding amongst many members of Parliament that they're there just basically to feather their own nests, Martin.
Well, that was always the case. If you go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, that was very much what went on, because they weren't paid as MPs at all.
Well, how do you sort that out? Because we need to try and disincentivise this sort of thing, don't we?
Well, you could argue, if you're a civil servant, you get well paid to be a top civil servant, but you're not allowed to do foreigners. You're not allowed to do any work outside your job. I used to work for the council as a council officer. I've got a full-time job in the council.
Couldn't you do a part-time job in a chip shop or something?
Well, you could, but you had to not in work hours. Now, when Rishi Sunak gave his tax returns last week, he earned $5 million in 3 years. Now, you feel like saying, now, you had a full-time job as Chancellor of the Exchequer and then as Prime Minister, which pays pretty well. You know, we're talking, 300, 400,000 for each for those kind of roles. But you still managed to make more money in your private work as a financial consultant, whatever it is. Now, there's two possibilities there. Either you weren't doing your job as Chancellor and Prime Minister, you were sitting on your phone buying and selling shares, or, and I think this is more to the point, you didn't have to do anything for that $5 million. You're already super wealthy. You just hand that money to your financial advisor. He invests it for you, and you get £5 million. So it's not work at all. And this is the problem with a lot of what goes on in the financialised economy. People who've already got money can make more money just by sitting there, and the money just earns.
I mean, shouldn't there be more curbs, Martin? Surely there should be much more curbs on the sources of funding for political parties. I mean, it would seem to make sense just to make a down payment for however many seats a political party wins into their account, and also the same with the local authorities too.
Yes,
so you're only getting paid. You're not allowed any money whatsoever from outside interests to lobby you.
Well, that is certainly the case in certain Scandinavian countries for obvious reasons. Don't forget, in Norway, for example, they were occupied by the Germans during World War II.
It would make an enormous difference, wouldn't it?
It would make an enormous difference. And the
other
thing you could say, I mean, obviously, what the Communist Manifesto says is that people who are elected to be MPs or whatever should earn as much as this is what they did in the Commune in 1870s. You can earn as much as a skilled worker and no more. And that's what so that skilled workers
that seems a bit mean. That seems a bit mean because anyone that's a really good MP should they of course they should be well rewarded for it. But the other thing, of course, is that they may well have shareholdings, for example, massive shareholdings in a business that they can then work to help without actually taking any money directly from them.
Well, that's presumably where Rishi Sunak's money's come from. He just owns loads of stuff and the money just comes rolling in. But that's the problem. That is actually parasitic. It's not actually, he's not managing anything when he's doing that, is he? What has he done to earn that money? And of course, what you could argue is that if we tax that money off him, he's not going to do any more work or any less work if we just take it all off him and put it in the pot.
The rich pay no tax. I mean, virtually none.
Well, the rate of tax on his $5 million was 22% or something like that, which is far lower than the average person on PAYE. So that's, and of course his wife wasn't paying any at all until it was pointed out that she was just working that loophole.
Yeah, and we had a Chancellor, didn't we, who wasn't even paying his tax. So look, let's have a listen to another bit from PMQs about how the wealthy don't really seem to pay their fair share.
David Linden.
The Prime Minister has previously been on camera as saying that he didn't have any working class friends. When he's not taking his luxury helicopter rides and splashing about in his private pool, where might the Deputy Prime Minister recommend he might befriend somebody from the working class?
Prime Minister.
I'm not sure I got the full extent of the question, but the reality is we're doing, and you can see that with the energy price guarantee, the free childcare and the national living wage, that we are supporting everyone in this country, particularly those on the lowest paid jobs.
Well, the energy price guarantee, which is the main thing that he's talking about there, that's just money for the electricity and gas companies. It doesn't go to the people concerned. They will pay for it from their taxes. It's going to be funded by the taxpayer, people on PAYE like myself, but not Rishi Sunak on 22% of a tax rate. So the attempt by the Tories to pretend that they're on the side of the struggling majority is patently silly. But nevertheless, they continue to do it because that's, you know, those who are in that bubble find it quite difficult to imagine being outside of it. I mean, Polly Toynbee years ago had a focus group with people from the City of London, and she asked, and these people are economists, you know, people who worked with money every day, and she said to them, would you like to guess what the average wage is in Britain? And none of them had a clue. They all guessed something like 40 or 50 grand. And of course, it's nothing like that. But of course, this was years ago. And you'd have thought, you're economists, you work in a bank, you analyse these figures every day, but you don't know what the average wage is.
We are drifting towards rule by accountants, aren't we? Where they're actually, it's a whole spreadsheet somewhere, and they're saying click, click. The other thing, of course, is that there's a basic fundamental problem at the heart of our economy, which is they're trying to push all the time for greater GDP. That means not necessarily that more is being produced, but that things that in the past were cheap or free cost more and more and more.
That's right. If you have to pay for it, it goes on to GDP. That's right. Well, I mean, it's the financialisation of the economy since the 1980s, which has been the most remarkable thing. You know, we used to have industrialists, and now we've got philanthropists who make their money through financial manipulation and financial engineering, and then because they give it away, they don't have to pay any taxes at all on it.
And also, of course, they're running a lot of the infrastructure and profiteering off of our needs to drink water.
And of course, ultimately, you see that when you are a global superpower like the US was until recently, it doesn't matter if you've got all these scams going on, because you're so powerful, you can carry on doing it, nobody can stop you. But what's happening now is they're up against peer competitors who are using the old methods. In other words, the Russians nationalised arms industry. It costs 1/10 of what we spend, and it's better.
We'll be coming to
that's the truth.
We'll be coming to the American war, if we can call it that. It's certainly a form of warfare, economic warfare or whatever, propaganda war against China later, because what's happened is, of course, the Chinese economy is so effective and efficient with their very, very low overheads for production, that is the infrastructure, and also low, because that means their raw materials cost less, etc., etc. Their fuel costs less, much less than here. They're able to way out compete the Americans, and so that's why the Americans seem to be getting so aggressive around the world, is because they're just failing to compete. But anyway, one thing that's been privatised again is the Royal Mail. And even now, it's been so-called privatised. They are now saying, I could not quite believe this story this week, record profits, Martin, and yet the Royal Mail is threatening to go into administration, and it's threatening its workforce, the Communication Workers Union, that unless they drop their strike demands and their pay demands, that they're just going to close the company down.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam President. Despite Royal Mail posting record profits, management are threatening to put it into administration. Can I ask what conversations the government is having with Royal Mail and what it's doing to protect the Universal Postal Service?
Deputy Prime Minister.
It's an incredibly difficult time. Can I thank her for a question? Obviously, the pandemic has had a particular impact, but we're working very closely to make sure we can continue the service, and I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss her concerns further.
Well, that's a non-answer, if ever there was one. No answer at all. And so the Royal Mail strikers were given 48 hours to accept a new pay deal, or else risk having the entire company shut down by the management.
Well, that is financialisation in a nutshell, isn't it? We can just dismantle the whole company, sack you all. This is what P&O did with the people on the ships, isn't it?
That's right. Communication Workers Union, by the way, that was 3 days ago, have just ignored this call. They are still trying to negotiate with Royal Mail, but this is it's an authoritarian tactic, isn't it? Royal Mail they're bad losers, basically.
Well, it's what used to be called a lockout. So this happened in the 1930s in the US. Ford just closed his factories and refused to pay anybody. We're just closing the factories because I'm trying to get rid of the unions here. People went down to protest outside the factories, and the Pinkerton men opened fire on them with machine guns. This is, as we go into the next phase of capitalist crisis, this is exactly what's going to... Royal Mail used to belong to the British people. It used to be a nationalised industry until the Liberal Democrats got their hands on it.
King Charles makes of it. If in any way is it still royal?
Well, if you remember, they changed the name of it once they privatised it to Consignia, because they said, somebody was paid a consultancy fee, just like for the Harbour here, to come up with the name Consignia, because nobody understood what Consignia was. So they eventually they stuck with Royal Mail as the brand, because it's a brand. It's got, Postman Pat and all the rest of it. But of course, in actual fact, it's just become, it's owned by hedge funds. That's the reality. Foreign hedge fund people own the Royal Mail.
The chief executive of Royal Mail has been accused last week of incompetence and cluelessness by MPs, calling on the regulator Ofcom to investigate whether the company has broken legal service requirements. Parliament's Cross-Party Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee asked the watchdog to investigate a suspected breach of the Universal Service Obligation, which requires postal operators to deliver letters nationwide 6 days a week. The MPs accused the Royal Mail of prioritising parcels over letters and claimed on Friday the company had systematically failed to deliver parts of its obligations. This is what it's legally required to do. It's just going, let's just shrug our shoulders and forget it. Royal Mail's chief executive Simon Thompson gave evidence to the committee in January, but in an unusual move, he was recalled after he was accused of giving an inaccurate testimony. Thompson then admitted digital tracking devices carried by postal workers were used to pressure them to work faster, and blamed rogue managers for using the information in breach of the company's own policies. The chair of the committee, Darren Jones, that's one of our Bristol MPs, said that after the first hearing he'd received almost 1,500 communications with evidence that showed tracking information from postal digital assistants, that's these little devices carried by the workers, was 100% being used to discipline and performance manage staff.
Well, they're not full. The privatisation of Royal Mail, which was carried through by Vince Cable, if you remember, it should never have been privatised. It's like lots of other things. It should be a public utility run in the public interest.
By having a go at Royal Mail, aren't the MPs actually playing into the hands of these other DPD and these other private providers?
Well, I mean, the point is, what's actually happening here is that even the Tories are worried that they're going too far. And the same thing happened when P&O sacked all of their workers at Hull, if you remember. Even the Tories saying this is completely wrong, they shouldn't be allowed to do this. But they can do it under the trade union legislation that they brought in. And then they say, oh gosh, this is a bit over the top. And of course, people are beginning to realise we should never have privatised the Royal Mail. Simple as that. We should never have privatised.
Let's just say, we should never have privatised electricity.
We should never have privatised the railways.
No,
and all of these things.
The ports,
and of course, we're now up
the
against
airports.
We're now up against China and Russia. Russia, you've got a centre-right government, but they certainly believe in nationalised industries, as centre-right governments here used to do. The Heath government nationalised Rolls-Royce. No problem.
You can no longer read my article I did on the death of Margaret Thatcher for RT years ago, but I did an actual list there, a kind of timeline of the Thatcher era, and one or two of the privatisations like the railways that happened afterwards. It really is quite shocking to look at. Every year, 2 or 3 major industries, Martin, during the 1980s were just sold off to the highest bidder. They all
it wasn't to the highest bidder. Some of it was actually sold off at less than it was worth. This is what happened with the Royal Mail. And of course that means that's a killing for those who get in on the ground floor. But of course it subsequently means that the Exchequer loses the revenue. If you sell things for what they're actually worth, a lot of people won't want to buy them because the shares will be too highly priced. So in order to get the stuff off the hands of the government, and council houses is a classic example of this, you sell it for less than it's worth, which is stealing from the taxpayer. That's what it is. And the poor taxpayer on PAYE who pays their tax as it comes out of their paycheck before they get it, and of course it's free money for Rishi Sunak's business advisor who buys the shares at less than they're really worth and then stags them
insider dealing?
Well, yes, it is, but of course it's legal insider dealing. And this is what's been, and of course they encourage people to, do you remember Tell Sid, encouraged people to invest in British Gas shares. British Gas shares were priced at such a level that whoever bought those shares, and of course people had to have money to spare to buy them, so they weren't the poor, they made immediate capital gains, which of course then encouraged them to vote Tory because they'd been bribed with the taxpayers' money. And of course the taxpayers, the people who pay the most taxes in this country, are people who buy food. Poor people, they pay a huge percentage of their income in tax. far more than wealthy people.
And finally, at Prime Minister's questions, the health service.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In a shocking article in Surrey Live last year, it was reported that staff at a GP practice in Walton were left in tears and crumbling under pressure due to the increased workload caused by staff shortages. Is it any wonder when there are 850 fewer GPs across the country since 2019? So what does the Deputy Prime Minister say to those patients left in pain and staff left in tears, including in his own constituency, due to this government's failed promise to recruit more GPs?
Like, can I say to her, any abuse against any GP in any practice across the country is absolutely wrong. We have to have zero tolerance of it. What I would just say to her is we've seen a large increase in GP appointments, over 29 million carried out since the start of the year. We're improving access to general practice with more support staff, also the technology, so more state-of-the-art telephone systems. The number of GPs in training is at record levels, and we're investing 1.5 billion to create 50 million more appointments a year by 2024.
If we go a bit faster, we'll get everybody in.
So, I think she was having a bit of a dig at him there, but he didn't answer the question at all, did he?
Well, he seemed to presume that the question was about abuse of staff,
Which
and that wasn't
No.
in the question.
No.
And of course, the fundamentals are that the other countries realise that you've got to carry on spending more on healthcare as time goes on.
We should actually be cheering, really, because the National Health Service still hasn't been privatised. All the other things we were talking about.
It has. It's being privatised bit by bit. Dentistry is effectively now privatised in this country. It's not supposed to be. There is supposed to be an NHS dentistry system, but it's just collapsed because the amount of money the government will pay for NHS work is the dentists can't make any money out of it. So they're not prepared to do it.
Well,
so in other words, that's it. Dentistry has just been privatised. Bang.
Do you know what the first big act of Margaret Thatcher was when she came in 1979, May the 4th? It was actually December before she did anything really, really big. That was the abolition of exchange controls.
Yeah, well, the abolition of exchange controls before 1979, you couldn't take more than £1,000 out of the country without permission.
What it enabled people to do was all over the world was basically buy up the British industry she was about to sell off.
Well, that's right. In other words, there was never any question in this country of saying, trying to ensure British control of British industries. Other countries, like Germany, for example, even if an industry is privately owned, they've got a strong interest in making sure that it fulfills national policy.
Okay, we can have a bit
Volkswagen, for example, a large chunk of their shares are owned by local governments in parts of Germany. And the free-for-all approach we've had in this country is based in the City of London,
if you've got merchant banks and Thatcher
if you've got the money, you can have what you want.
In my little article, I talk about Victor Rothschild and his role in the Thatcher government. He was a Labour peer, but she seemed to do everything he wanted, including impose the poll tax. Anyway, we're going to have a bit of fun. I think it's a bit of fun anyway, and run through some of the privatisations from the 1980s. The year is 1980. Buses, British Aerospace, that is the aircraft manufacturers, and local government was stopped from building council houses. That's just in 1980, Martin.
Yes, and we're now in 2023, and the consequences of those idiotic decisions have come back to torment us. There's no decent housing. Aerospace industry, don't forget, most of that is actually military, so all the money that we could be spending, if we're going to go to war with Russia and spend the money, the profit should go to the government. But no, it goes to private sector, it goes to the US private sector.
In 1983, Associated British Ports was privatised. 1983 also, British Shipbuilding was privatised, and Margaret Thatcher, on the back of the Falklands War, got another term. 1984 to 5 was the miners' strike, the close down of the nationally owned mines, and 1984 another couple, British Leyland was privatised. There was the Brighton bomb in 1984, but also BT, British Telecom, the old post office, was privatised.
Well, that's right, and of course, all of these privatisations were unnecessary privatisations. There was no economic rationale for privatising those. Shipbuilding, you could make a case, possibly. Telecoms, you could argue that we're going to develop a different system in the future which will be more diverse and it won't just be a monopoly. But even so, you don't have to sell off the monopoly provider. You just allow other firms into the industry if that's what you want to do. The whole policy, the creation of a private sector economy is because it creates political support for Toryism. The selling off of council houses was deliberately designed. I mean, in Westminster, Lady Shirley Porter, who was the head of Westminster Council, was making sure that certain wards had their private council houses sold off as quickly as possible, so that she could move in Tory voters into those houses. And she eventually was prosecuted for it and had to flee to Israel. This is what this is all about. It's the creation of a rentier class who basically profit from the financialisation of the economy and of the infrastructure.
Well, okay.
And they are the swing voters under a first-past-the-post electoral system, so they get what they want.
On the, what you call the circle of hell that was the 1980s, the Battle of the Beanfield, 1985, these horrific attacks on the travellers, the peace convoy, 1986 Wapping dispute, Rupert Murdoch was embracing electronic publishing and getting rid of a lot of the print unions. But 86, we also saw the British Airports Authority privatised, so the airports sold off. In March, the abolition of the Greater London Council, because Ken Livingstone and the Labour Party in London were pushing back, which of course our Labour Party in Bristol doesn't do at all, and under Starmer doesn't do nowadays. Also in 86, there was something called the Big Bang. That was quite important too, Martin, wasn't it?
Well, yes, because the deregulation of the financial markets at that stage led directly to the crash of 2008. And of course, if you were going to follow a free market textbook, when the crash came in 2008, and what's happened recently is you just let the banks go down. That's what the free market textbook says.
Took 20
but if you
years.
do that, then the whole society might go down. Oh, so we have to bail it out. Now, once you've bailed it out, if you've bailed out the banking system, that is in fact the beating heart of the economy. And the government, having bailed out the banking system, could run the banking system as a public utility, as the Communist Party in China do. And that's one of the reasons why they're going to win World War III.
And in
we're going to lose.
Also in 1986, in December, British Gas was privatised. Oh, look, isn't that funny now what's happening? 30, 40 years after that is the, well, no, not quite 40, 35 years or so, is the gas prices being hiked by these private companies for the benefit of shareholders. And that's 1986. In 87, we saw some very critical programmes about the Thatcher government at the BBC, and Victor Rothschild stepped in to ask Marmaduke Hussey, who was the chairman of the BBC, if he could sack, which he did, the Director General Alistair Milne. That was 87. Also, 1987, British Airways was privatised. British Petroleum's majority share in that was privatised. Rolls-Royce Aero Engines was privatised. And amazingly, of course, Thatcher won again in 1987. So 88, British Steel was privatised. 1989, British Aerospace was fully privatised. It had been part privatised previously. In 1989, the water boards were all privatised. And 1990, the Electricity Act became the complicated privatisation of electricity. So when we reach 1990, we have the poll tax riots, and we also have the resignation of Geoffrey Howe and the booting out of Thatcher in 1990, but there were a few other privatisations after it, as I said, like the railways. But that was pretty much it, Martin. The 1990s were the year where the mixed economy was had a knife stabbed into its heart. The idea being that all of this stuff, which was owned by the public and managed by the government openly, you could go along to these various board meetings if you wanted to. It was all done in public. Suddenly went underground, undercover, and also was available to be sold off privately all over the world.
Well, that's right. And of course, when you say she won again in 87, she didn't get 50% of the vote. In any other country in Europe, she would never have been the Prime Minister. It's as simple as that. But we're used to putting up with being bullied in this country. We're just used to it.
And that article I wrote back in, I'm not entirely sure what year it was published. It's also in my book, by the way. The Siege of Heaven, in April 2013. That was published. That was when Margaret Thatcher died. I will put that up on our show page because it's behind the Chinese firewall that we've got around Britain at the moment, where you can't read Russian articles published on the RT website on Sputnik and similar things. And while we're talking about Sputnik, Martin, the Russians have been over to interview Dr. Chris Busby about depleted uranium. Do you want to just say something about why this whole issue of the British, rather than anyone else, supplying depleted uranium shells to Ukraine is so key?
Well, I think the British have boasted about supplying depleted uranium shells because there's a kind of competition going on in amongst mainstream politicians in the West to be who can be the most stupid about provoking the Russians. But of course, I believe that the Americans are also going to supply depleted uranium shells.
Only if we do.
Yes, but that's right, because we go. That's why they wanted the Germans to supply Leopard tanks first, so that then the Americans say, well, they're trying.
We're just following in to help the Europeans out.
Yes. It's called lead from behind, which is why it was the French and British air forces who bombed Libya back to the Stone Age, with the Americans just helping with targeting, and it was a British and French operation. And incidentally, of course, in that operation, eventually the British Parliament had a committee that looked into it, and there was no evidence whatsoever that the Libyans were using air power against demonstrators. That was just made up. So in other words, the whole intervention was completely made up on the back of some false information, and of course that's what led to the surge in refugees all over Europe, because we knocked down a stable state in Libya and replaced it with anarchy. And that was our decision, our policy. British government, David Cameron, that's what he wanted to do. And of course, he was eventually caught out with his fingers in the till with fintech, lobbying Rishi Sunak to allow fintech to take over paying National Health Service pay. But of course, it then went bust, costing the taxpayer millions.
We do normally
he was trying to make £20 million out of that.
We do normally deal with international issues after the break, but I thought because this is, it's a British policy issue. Britain does, Martin, seem to be leading much of this, doesn't it? I mean, we're out supplying the Challenger tanks.
This time last year, it was Boris Johnson who took it upon himself to go and tell Zelensky to fight to the finish, even though Zelensky was talking to the Russians in Istanbul, mediated by the Turks and the Israelis to come to some solution. And of course, Zelensky this week was saying we've got to fight in Bakhmut to the end, because if we lose in Bakhmut, my people will want me to compromise. And you feel like saying, well, why don't you just compromise then? We've got to fight on, because otherwise my people will demand that I compromise.
Because NATO is egging him on, isn't it? Anyway, let's have a listen now to Vladimir Putin talking last week about this threat of the British to send depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine. And we'll afterwards hear from Dr. Chris Busby on his interview he did with the Sputnik. That's outside the firewall, folks. You get it only on here. Well, no, of course you can get your Tor browser or whatever it is. There are all sorts of other ways, VPN networks, to get through it. Maybe, in fact, we should do a whole item on how to get around the firewall, because this is Chinese-style tactics that our own government is using on us to keep us in the dark.
Russia, under pressure over its war in Ukraine, is increasingly dependent on China. And Vladimir Putin is increasingly critical of the West. Later, he slammed the UK for deciding to provide ammunition to Ukraine that contains depleted uranium.
I would like to note that if this happens, then Russia will be forced to take action accordingly. I'm talking about the fact that the West is already starting to use weapons with a nuclear component.
Tonight, this warning from Moscow has sparked a reaction from London. The UK Ministry of Defence has pointed out that depleted uranium has nothing to do with nuclear weapons or capabilities. It says it's a standard component the British Army's been using for decades, and that Russia is deliberately trying to disinform.
A Chinese peace initiative for Ukraine made little headway. President Putin blamed Kiev and the West. But this is a war he started, and he shows no sign he's ready to pull out his troops. Might Beijing be ready to supply Russia with weapons? That key question was left unanswered. In any case, Xi's visit is seen here as a diplomatic coup. At last, the Kremlin has something to to celebrate. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, that's an extremely partial account, as you might expect from the BBC, and that would be acceptable if we could access RT's version of the same set of events, wouldn't it? But I mean, if people think that they're being given a balanced view by that, then that's delusionary. That clearly is not a balanced presentation.
We're definitely going to do that on this programme, and here's Dr. Chris Busby talking to Sputnik News last weekend. And actually, you've got a much fuller version. I'll be putting the full version up on our show page, including a video up of the interview at thisweek.org.uk and up on my BitChute channel. I might even try YouTube. Let's see if the YouTube will allow this to go up. But it's at the moment, you can't read it on the Sputnik website. But anyway, here's Dr. Chris Busby explaining just why the use of depleted uranium is so horrifically dangerous. As we know, in the past it was used in Kosovo by NATO. It was also used by the Americans in Fallujah, and it's caused absolute hell in those countries. Before we hear this, though, Martin, let's just say for a minute, explore this concept for a second. Using this in Ukraine is going to blight Ukraine forever, this stuff. So why are they doing it? Do they really want to blight Ukraine, or do they just want to blow up a few Russian tanks?
Well, as you say, it's got potential to cause all kinds of problems going forward, because it gets into the soil, and then, of course, the land then becomes unusable where it's been. And that's certainly happened in Serbia and Kosovo, and also in Iraq. And of course, the British person, the government spokesperson earlier, saying the British Army has used this for years. Yes, and it's caused problems for years. I mean, the reason? Don't forget, Ukraine isn't very far from Russia. They don't want loads of nuclear contamination there because it's right next to them. The British and the Americans, on the other hand, the Americans certainly, they're thousands and thousands of miles away. They really don't care what happens in Ukraine.
I find it amazing that the Russians are actually caring more about what the future of Ukraine than NATO is.
Well, that's because the Russians are fighting to stabilise their near abroad, as they call it, and they don't want to smash the place up, because they actually ultimately, I mean, what should have been happening all along is constructive business relationships between Ukraine, the Russian Federation and the European Union, and Ukraine could easily have been a bridge. And before the 2014 coup, there was a well understood series of understandings in Ukraine about people not pushing to be aligned with one side or the other. Ukraine just means borderland. It can either be a bridge or it can be a battlefield.
Okay, so
and we've decided it's going to be a battlefield.
So do you think the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Office are doing this willingly, or are they just being told to do it by the Americans?
No, I think that what's actually happening is even more bizarre than that. Is there's a bit in the West there's now become a huge competition to see who can be most pro-Ukrainian. So any analysis of the actual situation is out of them. Don't forget, it's quite possible that none of this weaponry will arrive in the Ukraine. It'll either be interdicted on the way there by the Russians, who are obviously destroying depots. I suppose if you blow up a depot full of DU shells, that may cause contamination.
Well, it's like hitting a nuclear power plant. It's rather irresponsible.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that these DU shells, when they hit things, it's
well, I imagine it's part of a shell.
Yes,
which if you hit the shell, that DU is going to go up, surely.
Yeah, but it's not explosive, so it might. Anyway, the point is, a lot of it is just going to be sold on the black market, and much of it isn't going to get there. So there's an element of performative.
Fascinating. It's absolutely insane. I mean, what the British role here is, the role of the British here is particularly pernicious and particularly evil.
The role of the British in relation to the conflict in Ukraine has been disgusting. I mean, I've got no particular, nothing surprises me, a man of the world as I am, but it is still appalling that Britain should be the errand boy to try and make the war carry on when the locals have decided that it's possible that they could do a deal. And we're saying, no, don't do a deal. We want you to fight on.
Okay,
and of course, what ought to happen is that wherever Boris Johnson ends up, maybe at Texas or somewhere in this country, maybe he should be exposed to depleted uranium, because he's certainly responsible for the war in Ukraine. He set himself up as a British Prime Minister to sabotage a peace agreement. He was doing it as an errand boy for the Americans, but even so, it's still a shameful thing for a British Prime Minister to be doing.
Let's have a listen.
And of course, Keir Starmer would have been no better.
To nuclear scientist from the low-level radiation campaign and many other places down in Bideford, Devon, Dr. Chris Busby, and after after we've heard this, we will be listening, I hope, to a little explanation from him about how he's been completely destroyed and cancelled here in Britain as a credible scientist by the writer George Monbiot.
Two things. First of all, depleted uranium is a byproduct of the nuclear industry that separates uranium into highly enriched uranium or enriched uranium, which they use for nuclear weapons or for nuclear power. And what's left behind is a uranium which hasn't got the highly radioactive or fissile, that stuff that can go bang, uranium-235 inside it. So it's a sort of waste product. Uranium itself is extremely dense, so it has a density of about 20 compared to lead, which is about 10. So it's very, very heavy. But that's not why it's useful in tank warfare. The reason it's useful in tank warfare is because when you shoot it at a hard target, like a tank, it catches fire. And it burns at an extraordinarily high temperature, thousands of degrees. And when it does so, it burns its way through the tank armor. And as it goes into the tank, the expansion of the heat of the air associated with the heat blows the top of the tank off. So I've seen lots of tanks in Kuwait in the border there. I went there in 2000, and I've seen lots of tanks that have been damaged by depleted uranium, and they're radioactive. So the other thing about depleted uranium is it is radioactive. It's weakly radioactive, but it is radioactive. But the most important thing about it is that uranium for a long time has been known to bind very strongly to DNA. Now, DNA is the target for all radiation effects. If you're looking at the reason why radiation causes genetic damage and cancer, it's been well accepted since the 1950s since the discovery of DNA in 52, that the DNA is the target for all this genetic effect. And since uranium binds to it very strongly, it has a strong chemical affinity for DNA. And this has also been known for a very long time. Uranium nitrate was used since 1960s as a stain, as an electron microscope stain. So you take your cells and you shake them up with uranium nitrate, and the uranium sticks to the chromosomes. And so when you fire the electrons in and you look through the microscope, you can see the chromosomes. There they all are, because they've got uranium on them. Now, if uranium is radioactive and it attacks the chromosomes, it binds to the chromosomes, and clearly it's going to be very, very much more dangerous than just the idea that it's some kind of neutral substance that you drink and then it goes out of your body and so on. It's a calcium seeker, and it binds to DNA. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it was discovered, actually mostly by me, or it was reported to the Depleted Uranium Oversight Board in 2004, that uranium has another property. Because it has a very high atomic number, if you look at the periodic table, you have all these atomic numbers. It starts with hydrogen 1, helium 2, lithium, sodium, and all the way down to the very heavy elements right at the end. Uranium has got the highest atomic number of any element on Earth. Of course, there are new ones now like plutonium, but up until the discovery of the fission of uranium had the highest atomic number, which is 92. And because of this, it acts as a sort of amplifier for normal radiation, natural background radiation. So we all live in an environment where we get gamma rays that come through our body and go out, and of course they're not good and they have an effect. But if you've got uranium inside you, then it intercepts this because of its high atomic number and all its electrons. And when it gets hit by a gamma ray, it shoots off a load of electrons, and this is called the photoelectric effect. It's the same effect that's used in photocells when you point a photocell at a light meter, and then you get these electrons, and that tells you how much light there is. So this is called the photoelectric effect, and in my opinion, and I've written quite a lot about this is the reason why uranium is very dangerous. First of all, it binds to DNA. Secondly, it causes these photoelectrons to be emitted into the DNA. And all studies that have been done of people exposed to uranium show massive chromosome damage. So when they look to see the chromosomes in their cells, in the peripheral blood cells and so on, they find massive amounts of chromosome damage. And this, of course, chromosome damage is the same thing that leads through to all these genetic effects of cancer and birth defects and so forth. So that's the reason why uranium is so dangerous. And I've seen a lot lately, since these arguments from President Putin about being very upset about the idea that the British are going to use uranium. He's absolutely right. And the British are saying, oh, no, it's perfectly safe, it's not even radioactive, and nobody has to worry about it, and so on. This is quite wrong, and dangerously so.
So that's Chris Busby explaining, I think, in pretty much layman's terms. Anyone that wants to look into this, what is depleted uranium? Why is it dangerous? How does it work? Quite clearly, Martin, when you use a depleted uranium shell, the dust that's then created, the gas actually that's then created, the uranium gas, is mega toxic. And not only is it possibly going to kill you, it will possibly kill your children and your children's children.
Well, that's right. I mean, the evidence from Fallujah and from Kosovo is pretty overwhelming about this. It really is a sort of weapon that you shouldn't really use. I understand that Putin has also said that the Russians have got DU shells. They've got loads of them, but they haven't been using them. And I think that at some point they're going to have to decide whether they're going to retaliate by using their DU shells.
Well, quite clearly,
if both sides are going to use DU shells, then the whole region could become extreme.
Well, I mean,
just think of the knock-on effect on things like agriculture. Let's just think about this for a minute, right? Is that if the other side has got some weapon of mass destruction of whatever sort, you have got to have it. You may not use it, but without it, say for example, poison gas is used. There may be a treaty saying no poison gas is allowed, but you've got to have that poison gas if you know the other side's got it too. Well, that's the logic of arms races, as we know. I think the whole point is that we're not. It's very difficult to see how this is going to not going to happen. I think the DU is going to arrive in the Ukraine, and some of it is going to be used. Hopefully, not that much, because the Ukrainian army is now very, very severely depleted. But it's totally irresponsible of Western politicians to pour more destructive weaponry into this conflict, which is exactly the point the Chinese were making.
This is such a horrific role that Britain is playing, and the most amazing thing, I suppose, in all of this story is how this brilliant scientist, who's Dr. Chris Busby, who's been working for the Ministry of Defence for years. He's an expert court case evidence defending people who've been irradiated while working on British submarines and things like this, and he's constantly flying around the world as an expert in various court cases, but he's been destroyed by a Guardian columnist called George Monbiot.
He had two main criticisms. The first one was that I was selling pills to the Japanese public, to protect against radiation. And he got a couple of tame scientists from the nuclear industry, in particular that woman, Jerry Thomas, to say that what I was saying was nonsense. In fact, so I was selling I wasn't selling anything, incidentally, but I did advise some people who wanted to head off the problems associated with the contamination from Fukushima, and I said that the best thing they could do was to take calcium tablets, and so a number of firms started selling calcium tablets, and they put my name on, Dr. Busby's calcium tablets, but I had nothing to do with any of them, and I didn't get any money from any of them. They just decided to do it. I told Monbiot this, incidentally, but he didn't report this in his article. And the second thing, which was wrong, of course, he talked to me, and I told him this, and he didn't report what I said. And then later on, I complained to the Press Complaints Commission, but they did nothing at all. The other thing he attacked me over was a study that I'd done showing that there were high levels of child leukemia along the North Wales coast. And this was associated with contamination from Sellafield. And when I did that, I was attacked by the Welsh Cancer Intelligence Agency. But in the end, it turned out the Welsh Cancer Intelligence Agency attack was completely misapplied. It was just wrong. It was dishonest. And they had to apologize, which they did apologize. But of course, none of this gets into the media, because the media is controlled by the people who want to push nuclear and have nuclear weapons and nuclear bombs, what I would call the nuclear military complex, what everybody calls the nuclear military complex. And these people are very powerful, and they still own, if you like, or direct increasingly the media circus which we see, the false truth about all of the things that we read on the internet, and the exclusion of Chris Busby in particular.
That's Dr. Chris Busby's take Martin, on why George Monbiot, and how interesting that it was after the Fukushima accident in Japan with the massive leak of radiation from a nuclear power station there, that George Monbiot changed his spots, changed his side, and decided to come out as a pro-nuclear campaigner because, up until then he'd been a so-called environmentalist.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's Jonathan Cook, who's now based in Bristol and used to be based in the West Bank in Palestine. He's written some pretty cynical articles about where George Monbiot has ended up. I think he's criticised. I mean, saying, for example, that he has nothing to say about. In fact, he has criticism of Julian Assange, for example, which is basically inexcusable. Well, I mean, George Monbiot has become an accepted. This is what happens. You can become an accepted radical voice. Of course, his father was chair of the Conservative Party, and he went to Eton, so he's hardly Arthur Scargill or Jerry Adams. So he comes from that sort of background, and of course, he's basically an establishment-oriented person. Yeah. Now, sometimes he comes out with stuff, like he did stuff about dentistry, an article about the collapse of the dentist.
Well, this is like the BBC. Of course, journalists have to do something reasonable in order to keep any credibility at all. But, of course, but when it comes to something like Chris Busby, this is a very carefully aimed attack on one of the only in the UK really independent-minded scientist who's pointing out the dangers of uranium and the nuclear industry.
And of course, Monbiot is very much of the view that climate change is the thing, and of course that has become a kind of shibboleth amongst green people, including Greens in Bristol. I'm a bit old-fashioned. I'm not really of that ilk myself. I think the real danger is nuclear war, and there will certainly be some climate change if there's a nuclear exchange, and it won't be very pleasant at all.
And there certainly will be no danger of the recession of the ice caps. In fact, they'll probably be heading towards the equator. But anyway, I think another thing would be interesting to cover, Martin, is the business in France, all of the everything that's been going on there, which I've been finding absolutely fascinating. But before that, what about the commercial development of gene-edited food is now legal in England? Amazingly, King Charles has just ticked and signed this off. I thought he was supposed to be into organic food, where you're not allowed to have any genetic food, but Charlie has now decided, King Prawn Charlie, that gene editing is fine. Supporters of the technology say it will speed up the development of hardier crops that will be needed because of climate change.
Well, in Russia, they've banned GMO crops. The Chinese were tempted to go down the road of GMO, but the Russians have persuaded them that it's a bad idea.
Wasn't there a massive debate about this in the 1990s, and the country decided, no, we're not having this, Frankenstein foods?
Also, of course, this is partly to do with Brexit, because, of course, the EU still bans GMO crops. Britain can now have them as part of our freedom, and so we're going to have them. Whether anybody will want to buy our stuff, you see, the Russians will say, well, you're not selling that in Russia. Not that we want to sell anything to the Russians anyway. If we did want to sell it to them, they'd say you can't.
Wales,
we're not having it.
Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland won't be allowed to do this, though.
Oh, right. So in other words, it's the English that are going to do it, because but Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland decided not to do it. I think it's a major issue in world politics.
There's a lot of money in this, isn't there? There are a lot of people who put a lot of money hoping that this is all going to be a massive new technology.
Well, I mean, the point is that there isn't any shortage of food on the planet. There's plenty of food produced by whatever methods we're currently using. The idea that we need to increase food production, and that's the problem, is a problem in itself. What we need to do is distribute the food better and make sure that poor people have access to it. But we don't really need any fancy technologies to produce food cheaper than we already do. We've got enough food. The problem is poor people never get to eat it.
That's true, yeah. The Precision Breeding Act allows only genetic changes that apparently could also have been produced naturally or through traditional crossbreeding programs already in use today, although this is difficult to check.
Yes, it is. And, of course, the thing is, if you start fiddling around with the genetic I mean, obviously, we've always done things like crossbreeding and seed selection and so on, but that's a very slow process. What they're doing here is they're taking a gene from a fish, for example, and putting it in a wheat. Now, that's potentially extremely
genetic
dangerous.
modified foods are allowed in the European Union, according to this BBC article. It's just that the extensive testing is not going to, or such extensive testing is not going to be required in the UK as would have been in the European Union.
Yes, okay. So in other words, the lobby for it is there everywhere. But as I say, it's been pretty decisively knocked back in Russia. They are selling their food onto the international market, saying absolutely no GMO in our food. And that's one of their, that's a sort of branding
Well, of course,
tactic.
this could include animals too. The RSPCA are livid. They're saying, what the hell are you doing?
Well, this is the kind of technology which the people who want to sell it want to push, but there isn't actually, why do we need it? We don't need it. It's
money.
That's it. And they can. The point is that
this is our species.
They can control the inputs.
You have to pay us for every sheet
that's
been made.
That's
like
right, because they're patenting all of this so that they can be paid a royalty every time it's used.
Yeah, more evil from Britain. Well done, folks. But we're going to have a little look at France now. And I spoke to Eric Simon, who's he's a lorry driver, and he spent a lot of time in the UK too. But he's got. He's saying basically that Macron's had it now, but that the system over there is rigged effectively. So, as we were saying earlier, a kind of dictatorship, and so the French aren't going to go away until Macron's gone.
I don't think that any change is going to happen through this political system. Absolutely not. It's rigged, Tony. Rigged for exactly like in the UK. It will come from one providential people, just like General de Gaulle was. And General de Gaulle was kind of muffled, damp, deep in, because General de Gaulle, from the early 1930s, as soon as Hitler arrived, he said, well, we should be doing this. We should rearm. We should not let Germany do this. So when Germany invaded the Ruhr, I don't know how you call that, the Ruhr, R-H-U-R, the Rhénanie, I think that's the word. General de Gaulle at the time, it was literally unknown. It was just a journal. He said we should stop them right now, not later, now, because otherwise it's going to kick off again. So, but he's been kept aside. And I think that at the moment there's nobody rigged. Okay, this system is made for other people, other powers to get control, but not the people.
It's Eric Simon. Another little clip. I'll put the longer interview up with him on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. He's very frustrated. You said the only people you need to do is look at where the money's going. Whenever it comes to international wars, crises of all sorts, where is the money going? Follow the money.
Follow the money. Who earns from it? And guess what? One of the main shareholder of Gazprom is only the Russian state that owns 50.2%, but 49.8% of Gazprom is held in the city of London. Who owns it? BlackRock does, So don't you think all these guys have an interest into war? The Russian state can be dragged into war forcibly by the actions of Zelensky and NATO, but 49.2% benefit from it in the city of London.
Yeah, thanks to Eric Simon for that. A longer interview will be up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. Martin, what do you make of what's been going on in France with these big demonstrations? I mean, really, really big. Not a lot really reported on the UK TV. I always want to see how big is this demonstration. Well, for example, when they had the anti-lockdown demonstrations in London, the only pictures that emerged of the whole thing were taken by Isabel Oakeshott, who happened to be up in a helicopter on her way somewhere. I don't know, because something to do with a different story. And she took a couple of photos and shared them on Twitter. But they were the only photos of the massive demonstrations in London. They're trying the similar sort of tactics in France, where they just show a few shots of a tiny group of people, but actually there's thousands, tens of thousands of people in the streets.
Well, more to the point, opinion polls show that 80% of the population of France do not want this pension policy, whereas the lockdown was a much more contested here, whatever the size of the demonstrations. This has been coming for ages, because in France they have had they take social protection very seriously in France, which is why they're not going to allow Brexit Britain to socially dump on them. Yeah, we are not going to have you supplying goods into our market with lower standards of environmental regulation or labour protection, because that puts our people out of work.
But aren't
and
they
we're not going to do that.
Aren't they socially dumping economic migrants on us?
No, Tony, because in actual fact, we went to war in Libya. Do you remember? Libya's the other side of France.
Hang on. I said economic migrants, not refugees.
Oh, no, well, most of the people trying to cross the channel are not economic migrants.
What about the others then? What about the economic migrants? That's what I'm not talking about.
But you're trying to make it all about migrants.
Well, no, you're saying, what you're saying is that the French and the British have got, it's a one-way thing.
We're talking about the social model in France as opposed to the social model in Britain, okay? In France, people expect to be able to retire. They expect to have a working time directive. They expect their weekends to be long. They expect long holidays. Per hour and per worker, they are more productive than the Germans. And we're way down that hierarchy, Tony, because British financial capitalists do not invest in this country.
Well, there's been an amazing development this week. I mean, I certainly raised my eyebrows. The British were talking about hiking up our pension age. At the same time, because of the protests in over in France, things have changed. Anyway, I spoke to the guy who speaks at Speaker's Corner and does the Marxist tours of London every week about this, and he pointed this out to me earlier on this week.
The peculiar thing is, if you look in the news today, it was reported last week in the FT, but in the news today they confirmed it, that the British government has withdrawn its plans to extend the pension age by 2 years. And last week they made a little report and they said, well, it seems that the Tories have looked over at France and said, we don't want that. And so, funnily enough, the protest movement in France has not achieved its victory, but it's achieved a victory over here. So, and probably in a number of other countries as well. So it may only be a temporary victory, but it's a victory nevertheless. But yes, the international elites, financial oligarchs, global financial institutions, all the WEF and all these institutional mechanisms they're creating for global dominance and using against the people, have got an extraordinary amount of power at the moment. At the same time, I suspect that they're in for a shock when movements develop from below that go beyond what's acceptable, that would take to the streets and take on a form that it can easily bring down their power. I don't think, you see, Macron was one of their puppet, figureheads. And I think his days are numbered, and I think that's representative of the mood in wider society. The same with Sturgeon, same with Jacinda Ardern. Okay, they fell over minor issues, but Macron, it won't be a minor issue. And Trudeau will probably fall. I don't know what the issue will be, but he'll fall as well. And so it's not, even though they try and cobble these people out and these puppets, I don't think the population really believe these people. I don't think they really got mass support. Macron for a moment did, but I don't think the others do.
So that's from the Speaker's Corner website and to the Marxist Tours of London. That's Heiko Koo. Full version of that go up on our show page later at thisweek.org.uk. But what about his wider point there, Martin, that actually these people are going to go, that because they have set themselves in many ways, particularly in France, quite clearly against the interests of the population. I mean, there are various points. Eric was making this point to me too, is that actually the pension crisis is not really a pension crisis. It's a crisis of the political system that has allowed this sort of thing to develop in the first place. And the idea that you're just going to have to blame the people for it. No, you have to blame the financial sector, and they're going to have to cough up.
Well, it's good to see that people are fighting back against what's been going on, but as we were saying earlier in the show, the financialised ruling class has had a pretty good run. They've privatised everything. They've reduced social security to a pipe dream. They've had various wars which they've profited from. If people are starting to fight back now, it's none too soon, is it? And if we can begin, I mean, I think people can sense that it wasn't the ordinary people in France who crashed the banking system in 2008, was it? So why the hell should they pay
Someone
for
like
it?
Emmanuel Macron cannot go out in the streets, can he, in France? It's impossible. We had a situation after the Second World War, really up until the 60s and 70s, where there was a general acceptance of the politicians were there, they were just doing their job, whatever. There was general peace. Now, ever since the Thatcher era, the politicians seem to have set their hearts against the people.
Well, that's to a certain extent true because they're vested interest behind them. But of course, it is also true that it is quite dangerous to be a politician. Olof Palme was assassinated in Sweden. He was just walking around as he expected to be able to do, probably assassinated by Gladio.
Well, he was just talking about de Gaulle, wasn't he?
Well, yes, de Gaulle was nearly assassinated by MI6 and the Americans because he took, and that's one of the reasons why he took France out of NATO. Interestingly enough, the right wing in France are not calling for pensions to be not paid to 62-year-olds. The right wing in France is in favour of keeping the pension age where it is. That's one of the reasons why that France is different from Britain. Jacob Rees-Mogg probably does want to increase my pension age, but Marine Le Pen doesn't.
I'm sure.
Also, Marine Le Pen is talking about if we're going to have sovereignty in France, maybe never mind leaving the EU. Maybe we need to leave NATO. Maybe we should leave NATO.
Well, this is back to de Gaulle again, isn't it?
It is.
The day of the jackal. And of course, that was the Americans.
And the British.
And
don't forget that the jackal in the book, which is a fictional book, was a British hitman, wasn't he?
But wasn't there a real attempt on his life?
Well, there were real attempts on his life. There was the OAS, the Organisation Army Secrète, which was the right wing inside the army, but they were working with the British and the Americans. De Gaulle wasn't a team player. De Gaulle would not have supported the war in the Ukraine, for example.
One of the first
Quite
things that
clearly,
happened
that's
after
the sort of thing he would have said, no, we're provoking the Russians here, let's not do this.
One of the first things
but
that happened
of course, he's not,
after
Macron is not De Gaulle.
The Second World War is the US troops were forced to go from
That's
France.
Right.
We never did that, did we? And they're still here.
Yes, they've got no US bases on French soil. And that's because they kicked them out. We could kick them out as well.
Why don't we do it? We're not going to, are we?
I think we are in the end, Tony.
You really think so?
Well, it depends. It depends. If we carry on down the road we're going, the elite, deep state in Britain could easily collapse. And if it collapses, then all bets are off.
Well, we shall see. Anyway, poem before we have our break. Another one from Patricia, bless her, this week. An ode to Charlie Bonkers. Charlie loves his egg tops cut off by his sycophants, sausage fingers, madman bee, and ironed underpants. He lords it over everyone, talks big on climate change, yet travels round the world first class and lives it large in planes. Is he on a mission to do WEF's dirty work, as all he does is swan around on a hard day's night off shirks? Sausage fingers emissions burnt, yet intervention is his game. Is Klaus Schwab his master, as the words sound just the same? Preaching from his pulpit, in fact, he sounds insane. Globalist Charlie Bonkers, whose track has lost the train.
Everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plan, a time to dance, a time to mourn, and a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time of love, a time of hate, a time of war, a time of peace, and a time you may embrace, a time to refrain from embracing. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to gain, a time to lose, a time to rend, a time to sow, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for peace. I swear it's not too late. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. I see plain magicians sitting lotus on the floor, barely dancing beauty with their power-driven soul. Had my share of nightmares, didn't think there could be much more. And in walked Roderick Usher with the Lady Eleanor. She tied my eyes with the ribbon of a silken ghostly thread. I gazed with troubled vision on an old four-poster bed, where Eleanor had risen to kiss the neck below my head, and bid me come along with her to the land of the dancing dead. But it's all right, Lady Eleanor. All right, Lady Eleanor. I'm all right where I am. She gazed with the love and beauty like a mother to a son, like living, dying, seeing, being all rolled into one. And all at once I heard some music playing in my bones, the same old song I'd heard for years, reminding me of home. But it's all right, Lady Eleanor. Then creeping on towards me, licking lips with tongues of fire, a host of golden demons screaming lust and base desire. And when it seemed for certain that the screams could get no higher, I heard a voice above the rest screaming, "You're a liar." But it's all right, Lady Eleanor.
Okay, that's Lindisfarne from 19... Do you want to guess, Martin?
72.
70, yeah, not far off. And before that, from 1965, Turn, Turn, Turn by the Australian band with Judith Durham, The Seekers. So, welcome back to Not the BCfm Politics Show. For those that want to bypass the psychopath in the corner, on the talkradio.org.uk stream and live on the Not the BCfm Politics Show app, available free from all good app stores. Anything, please, but Google. Also joining us is Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, and on the line from Hungary is George Samueli. Hi, George. Welcome to the Politics Show.
Hi, Tony. Nice to talk to you again.
It is fantastic to hear your voice, George. And one of the reasons I like to talk to you is because you have a sort of wry approach to many of the things that go on in the world. Because I think for some of us, it's a bit sort of doom and gloom, isn't it? You know, but actually, at the end of the day, whilst things might seem, frightening, horrible, actually, there's a kind of use of fear, I think, in order to try and sort of corral people. But let's start today by just looking at this announcement about Finland joining NATO, because this is quite an important move. Finland was supposed to be neutral, but now, of course, they're right. I mean, of the three big Scandinavian countries, we're not including Denmark, but of those three countries, the Finland is one that butts up right against Russia, not very far at all from St. Petersburg.
Yeah, no, there's no question. Finland was quite lucky, really, to enjoy that neutral status after World War II. Keep in mind, Finland had been aligned with Hitler and had taken part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. They then, after having been defeated, they then dropped out in 1944. They could have been punished like many other of Hitler's allies were punished by having a communist regime imposed on them. But the Soviet Union didn't do that. They essentially gave Finland every latitude to run their own affairs. The only thing that they asked for in return was that Finland pursue a neutralist foreign policy. And that's exactly what Finland managed to do throughout the Cold War. Finland, I think, did very well out of it. It's hard to see in what way any of Finland's rights of sovereignty were impinged upon by the Soviet Union. Now, what they've done now, of course, is essentially by being, as you said, right up against Russia, an 800-mile border now between NATO and Russia. Finland is in the crosshairs. Because if there is to be a war between Russia and NATO, something that was actually pretty much inconceivable during the Cold War, not inconceivable anymore, then Finland will be in the front line. I mean, whether it'll be through a Russian missile attack, whether through Russian invasion, but Finland will not be able to enjoy what they might have enjoyed during the Cold War, which is that they will be able to stay the hell out of it. This time, Finland will be in the front line. So it's hard to see what exactly Finland has gained by this.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Martin, what do you make of Martin Summers?
Well, I think that's I totally agree with what George just said. Jared Diamond wrote a book about how countries can recover from crises like human beings can, and one of the chapters was about Finland and about how they reorganised their thinking about their place in the world at the end of World War II, because as you say, they were involved in the siege of Leningrad. There was lots of reasons for the Soviets to be quite hostile to them, and by being neutral, they actually became the place for negotiations to take place. So the Helsinki Accords, signed in the 70s in Helsinki, Finland became punched way above its weight as a neutral state. And I find it absolutely appalling and inconceivable that the, generally competent left-leaning government in Finland have allowed themselves to be bamboozled into this idiotic decision.
Well, okay, George, what's your thoughts on that? Because it seemed almost as if everybody in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia is clamouring to be in the front line in America's war against the Russians.
Well, you have to keep in mind that there no longer is any kind of a European identity, any appreciation on the part of European leaders that they have interests of their own separate from that of the United States. Any sense that there is a Europe with its own distinctive outlook and there's America with its distinctive outlook, something that used to be the case during the Cold War, when you had during the 1960s with de Gaulle, during the 1970s and 80s with Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, and incidentally Helmut Kohl, who was a conservative. There was a distinctive European approach to international. The elites of Europe today are essentially bought and paid for by the United States. They are not in any way representative of the European people. And so they pursue goals that are American goals. They're not goals of Europe. So,
hang on, because we've just been talking about France and de Gaulle, George, before you popped up. And what is the process by which, since the Second World War, slowly but surely, these European countries have been brought to heel by the Americans? I mean, it's almost happened in a big kind of in smoke-filled rooms. And what are the institutions? How has this taken place?
Well, obviously, one way is through the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the Americans have poured a lot of money into cultivating a new elite through its various organizations, whether it's the AID, the Agency for International Development, through the State Department. They bring would-be elites to the United States. They wined and dined and entertained there, flattered, and then they go back to their countries and to pursue the Americans' goals. So if you look at these leaders, and Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, the Green, she's a very good example of this. She's totally Americanized. I mean, everything about her is American. She, there's no resemblance to what used to be at least a kind of German leftism or German environmentalism, or the kind of things that one remembers from the Greens of the 1970s and 80s. She's a totally American creature. She sounds American. She, all her ideas are like warmed over cliches from the U.S. State Department. And she said openly, I don't really care very much about what the German voters want. I know what's good for them. And because, she is essentially entirely identifies with the Americans. Now, this woman, this Marin, this Finnish kind of social democrat, who may or may not lose office this weekend, she's another one. All these are kind of young leaders who are cultivated by the World Economic Forum, then inserted into their slots. They're all kind of the same. They're all very young. They're quite cute, telegenic. They don't have any ideas at all. They're kind of inserted into their particular slots, and they spout the cliches that the Americans want spouted, and that's why you kind of wonder how is what Marion doing in Finland enhancing Finnish national interest. And then you have these people in the Baltics as well, who are screaming about, Russia is this, Russia that. Well, I mean, if you're really worried about Russia, if you feel there's a threat from Russia, doesn't it make sense for you to try to make friends with Russia? I mean, if you're afraid of somebody, you don't try to antagonize them, but they go out of the way to antagonize Russia because that's what's expected of them. That their masters, the people who have cultivated them and invested money in them, that's what they want from them.
Yeah, we were hearing from Jeffrey Sachs last week, George, that actually he believes anyway that the conflict in Ukraine is really more about the ultimate aim of it is to knock Russia out of the way because America wants to deal with the Chinese.
Well, I mean, I think there's some truth in that. It's not so much that the Americans are worried about China. I think they're worried about Russia and China together. They want to break up that.
Yeah, but they're forcing the two together.
Of course, that's their problem. What the Americans are calculating is that they can bring Russia to its knees. I mean, that's really what they're doing in Ukraine. I mean, they couldn't care less about Ukraine. You know, they're ready to kill every single Ukrainian on the face of the earth if they think that it gets them to their end, which is to bring Russia to its knees, topple Putin, and who knows then what happens? You know, disintegration of the country. All of Russia's natural resources are up for grabs. That's the goal. And then once Russia is out of the way, they can deal with China. But they regard that if Russia and China are together, then those two powers together are just far too strong for the United States and NATO. So they need to break them up, and they're going to do it by essentially trying to destroy Russia. That's their ultimate objective: regime change in Moscow.
I think that is their objective, but it seems that they're not actually succeeding.
Well, they're
for various reasons.
On a hiding to nothing, aren't they?
Well, they're not on a hiding to nothing because if your goal is to make trouble, then that's quite easy to do, isn't it? You don't necessarily have to have a positive outcome. You just make life miserable for people.
Well, okay, but surely the idea is to turn the Russian people against their president. That's going to be a very, very awkward. It's a big ask because actually he's much more popular than any of the Western leaders.
Well, that's true.
In his own country.
And in any case, even if Putin went, the political conditions in Russia will not necessarily lead to a pro-Western regime. It just won't.
Right. Now, I think that's obviously right. But the way the Americans think, they think that if this war goes on and Russia continues to lose manpower, obviously sort of loses wealth, and Russia is not actually achieving victory, then the people will turn against Putin. That's the Americans' calculation. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but that's how the Americans figure. And then, Putin will be toppled. Now, I agree. What happens then is up for grabs, because it may be that if Putin is toppled, if he's replaced by a leadership that say, look, Putin is just not a wartime leader. He's past it. He doesn't know how to win this war. Then whoever takes over is going to pursue that war. I mean, they're not just going to allow the country to disintegrate. I mean, I would assume there will be somebody who will say, we need to mobilize the country's resources, we need to run a war economy, and we need full mobilization. We need to win this war. I think that's what any post-Putin leadership will insist on. So I think the Americans are making a miscalculation if they think, oh, great, Putin will be gone and the country will just simply disintegrate. I don't think that's all happen.
No. Well, let's go over to the heart of the problem, really, which is the belly of the beast, if you want, the empire itself over in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we've had some pretty amazing announcements this week. There's been attempts with Boris Johnson to haul him over the coals last week in a rather tame manner about Partygate, but rather more serious cases in the United States. Of course, this is not the only attempt that there's been to prosecute Donald Trump. It seems the obvious objective of this is for the criminal justice system in the United States to stop him standing for president. But anyway, let's have a listen now to a rally, which is what Donald Trump was doing in Waco in Texas this week, because he had quite a lot to say about the deep state.
The stakes of this election could not be more clear. Either we surrender to the demonic forces abolishing and demolishing and happily doing so our country, or we defeat them in a landslide on November 5th, 2024. Either the deep state destroys America or we destroy the deep state. That's the way it's got to be. We're at a very pivotal point in our country. Either we descend into a lawless abyss of open borders, rampant killings, super hyperinflation, which is what we have right now and not coming down, and festering corruption, or we evict Joe Biden and the Democrats from the White House and we make America great again.
So that's Donald Trump speaking in Waco, Texas this week, George. What do you make of his bid to become president? He seems to be getting more and more feisty about calling out these institutions that, often it's conspiracy theorists, apparently, who talk about something called the deep state, the permanent government, the military-industrial complex, that sort of thing. In fact, he used the expression military-industrial complex in his in his talk as well, and he was, I think, he's bringing up this whole issue of who's really in charge. He's also on the record as saying, well, the Ukraine war would never have happened under his watch, and if he's made president, he'll stop it.
Yes, that's right. He obviously knows from his own personal experience that the deep state tried to do him in. First, they tried to do him in before the election in 2016. Then they tried to do him in immediately after the election, again, by cooking up the Russiagate hoax, the Mueller investigation, and then they tried to do him in with the Ukraine gate, and they impeached him for Ukraine. So he knows that that they're going to be there waiting for him to destroy him. If he would ever to become president in 2024. And as you say, he's also brought up the Ukraine issue, and in a very interesting way, because in one interview with Sean Hannity, when he said that had I been president, this wouldn't have happened, I would have made some territorial concessions. Some of the areas that were Russian speakers, they could have been separated from Ukraine. That was quite an explicit statement from him. Sean Hannity kind of cut that out when he aired some of the interview for television. But then he's gone on record to say that he would insist on an immediate ceasefire, which is obviously complete anathema to U.S. policymakers, NATO, and so on. He's got a lot of enemies, and they're going to come after him. I mean, he caught them by surprise in 2016. They were ready for him in 2020, but they're going to be ready for him even more ferociously now. So he's got a very tough road ahead of him, because we had the indictment from New York, from the Manhattan district attorney yesterday, but that's the first of many indictments. There are going to be lots more indictments. There's going to be the indictment in Georgia. There's going to be a federal indictment, and there may be some more indictments. Maybe the New York State Attorney General will indict him. So they're going to hit him with so many different criminal indictments that he's going to be bogged down fighting off all these cases. Is going to cost him a lot of money. He's going to have to hire all kinds of lawyers, but it's also going to drain his energy. I mean, it's going to be very tough for him.
I'm not so sure about that, George. I mean, maybe if you and I were hit with those indictments, it would drain our energy. But in a way, Trump seems to be energized by these things, and he almost seems to come. He seems to come out. One of the things I loved about his speech, I mean, I didn't love a lot of the things he was talking about, migrants and things like that. This is really, it's actually just nonsense, a lot of it. But it's the fact that he does speak from the heart, off the cuff. He's not reading an auto cue. He's not reading a script, is he?
Right. No, I think that's a fair point. I mean, I think that he is very genuine, and that's always been his calling card. And that's, I think, is undermining Ron DeSantis, who has been hailed as the sort of the Trumpism without Trump, is that he comes across as a professional politician. He is unable to sound authentic. You always get a sense that everything he says is first poll tested. He's had his marketers and publicists work with him. So he doesn't have the authenticity which Trump has. But you raise a good point about is Trump energized by all these criminal cases, and does that make him stronger, or is it going to have an effect on him? He's not that young. I mean, he's not.
No. But I mean, it's also. I mean, it's also. It's bound to have an effect on the electorate, George, isn't it? Well, a lot of them are looking at it and saying, "Hang on, they're trying to get this guy," and that may actually have the opposite effect that the public prosecutors want it to have.
Right. That's true. And that could very well happen. The other side to it is that there are people in the middle who, even if they have sympathy for Trump and that they're out to get him, may just think, hey, we can't take another 4 years of this. This is just exhausting. This is going to be like this forever. Every single day is going to be just this constant battle between Trump and the media, Trump and the prosecutors, Trump and the deep state. It's just exhausting. And there's a lot of people who just prefer a quiet life.
Well, that's true.
So, if he were to win and take office in 2025, that means he'd be there till 2029. And then other people say, that means we will have had 15 years of non-stop Trumpian drama. And, you and I might enjoy it and think, great, makes life interesting, but not everybody thinks that.
Well, I don't find it. I find it actually boring, really boring, watching another fake indictment which comes to nothing. I mean, that's what has happened so far. We've had lots and lots of hot air, and this seems to me to be the idea, is that they're trying to put this stuff in the press, and it may be backfiring. But anyway, just looking at the actual what's going on over in Ukraine, we've heard today that President Zelensky says that if he uses Bakhmut, he will be pushed to compromise with the Russians. Talking to the Associated Press, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told AP, actually it's on Wednesday, not today, that if the Donbas city of Bakhmut falls to Russia, he'll be pressured to compromise with Moscow. Our society will feel tired. It's like we were talking about the Trump camp getting tired with these indictments. If the Russians win in Bakhmut, Zelensky said, our society will push me to have a compromise with them.
Well, I don't believe anything Zelensky says. He is driven by two goals. The first step, to get as much hardware and money out of the United States and the rest of the NATO gang, as much of that as possible. So how does he do that? By warning, well, if we lose in Bakhmut, we don't get enough hardware, I don't think I'd be able to hold on for much longer. I'm going to have to sign a deal with the Russian. And, of course, he's calculating that the effect that will have is that the Americans will say, oh, my God, that's the last thing we want you to do. How much more do you want? So that's, I think he's driven by that. But his ultimate objective is, of course, to get NATO into the war directly, because ultimately he can't really win this war by himself. So his hope is, to get NATO directly involved in the fighting.
I mean, I don't know if you've seen the war maps. I'm sure you have, actually, George. Bakhmut is really surrounded, and in fact, the Russians seem to have left a kind of corridor for the Ukrainian troops to escape if they wish to. So they haven't totally. I mean, they've got it as surrounded as you can be. But they seem to be allowing, saying, well, look, if you want to go, guys, go. But, we've got all the territory around the city, including several miles to the west. So if you want to go west, you can go through a little corridor we've left for you. But you may as well leave, or, if you don't want to die.
Well, no, I think so. But I'm not sure that that's the most effective strategy on the part of the Russians, because all that'll happen is that, they'll leave, and then they'll dig in somewhere else a few miles to the west. I mean, that's really been the way this war has continued. My own personal feeling is that Russia has to win this war. It has to wrap it up. The only way to win this is by the use of overwhelming force, whether overwhelming use of infantry, overwhelming military equipment, hardware. But it has to be done, to the point where really there is no escape. But that's not what has happened, and ultimately there hasn't been very much progress for quite a number of months. So I'm a little less sanguine as to the outcome of Bakhmut, particularly as I think that Ukraine will mount a counteroffensive sometime in April. I don't know whether that'll be successful, may well not be successful, but it will happen.
Is that with more equipment from the West? Is that all coming in nicely?
Yes, it is coming in from the West, and the Western powers want this counteroffensive. I mean, they're calculating that if they can force some kind of a major setback on the part of the Russians, and either Russia will be forced to the negotiating table, and they will, essentially admit defeat, or admit that they're unable to win this war, and then therefore they want to get out of it. Or ultimately, as I was saying earlier, they want to inflict such a humiliation on Russia that it will lead to regime change in Moscow.
Okay,
so there's no question that Zelensky is under pressure from the United States to mount an offensive, and very soon.
So what's your thoughts about, I mean, obviously you were based in Eastern Europe. How has the Ukraine war gone down in Eastern Europe, do you think, in countries like Romania, in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, places like that, which were old Soviet countries? I mean, what is their view of what's been going on over in Ukraine? Some of them, I would imagine, are looking at it and saying, well, actually, good on the Ukrainians giving the old Soviet masters a bloody nose. Others, not so sure. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think that in Eastern Europe, the attitude are very similar to Western Europe, which is I think that the public is not on the same page as the leaders. The leaders are all on board with NATO, but the public is really quite skeptical. They are suffering the consequences of the war through inflation. They're obviously also very nervous that the war could spill over and that it's going to affect them. And there isn't any real sympathy for Ukraine, but the leaders, they go to all these meetings and say, we need whatever it takes, we have to support Zelensky. I don't think that's the mood of the public in Eastern Europe any more than it is in Western Europe.
I mean,
the one political leader who has expressed this view is Viktor Orban of Hungary. The problem is, of course, that Hungary is quite a small country and therefore is of limited influence. But nonetheless, I mean, he has said that that the view of Europeans, they want this over, and they want inflation to come to an end, and they want to get back to normality, and they don't want this war to go on.
Yes. So, I mean, if you look at for example, what's been going on in the meantime over in the Middle East, there seems to be some rapprochement between countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has almost been happening on the sidelines of this. So, and I'm also wondering whether some of these Eastern European leaders aren't thinking, well, let's just agree with the Americans for now. I mean, let's face it, this was Putin's tactic after 2000. Let's just be friends. Let's join the G8 and things like that. But actually, in the back of their mind, they're thinking, well, at some point, they may be fair weather friends, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that they feel that they're getting a decent enough deal out of it. I mean, they're handing over all these weapons, and then they imagine that the Americans are going to replace them with all that Soviet stuff that they handed over. It'll be replaced by top-of-the-line American equipment. That will happen, but the Americans are going to charge them a pretty penny for it. They're not just going to give it away. But there's no question that they want to keep in with the Americans because they're afraid of the Americans. I mean, the Americans can do all sorts of very nasty things if you don't toe the line. I mean, Viktor Orban hasn't toed the line. I mean, they're plotting to overthrow him all the time. And he has more or less. He's gone along with NATO and the EU. He's just carved out little special dispensation for him on oil and on some other sanctions. But basically, he's gone along with NATO and the EU, and even so, he's the constant target of American plotting. We had USAID Director Samantha Power here a few weeks ago, throwing around money like confetti to all sorts of anti-Orban groups. And Hungary wasn't even invited to Biden's democracy summit. So I think that a number of these East European leaders are worried that if they fall out with the Americans, they're going to be the target of color revolutions.
Ah, right. Yeah, may well be. Also, I think the Americans must be fuming today because the Chinese have brokered an Iran-Saudi Arabia reconciliation effort. Now, on the official side, the US is saying that one of their Middle East envoys is saying that they're very hopeful that the Saudi-Iran detente will help the region. But actually, behind their backs, surely they're fuming.
Yeah, of course they're fuming. You'd have to say, though, they brought this on themselves. The Biden administration pursued a very hostile policy toward Saudi Arabia, but without doing the commensurate thing, which is to improve relations with Iran. So Biden, who had promised vaguely during the 2020 election that he would return to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran and the denuclearization of Iran, negotiated with Iran. It went nowhere. So America hasn't returned to the JCPOA. But at the same time, Biden went out of his way to piss Mohammed bin Salman off. And the Saudis are really, quite tired of this. The Saudis really don't like, being essentially America's cat's paw. But Biden made a fundamental blunder in bringing up the whole issue of Khashoggi. There was absolutely no reason to obsess about Khashoggi. It was basically kind of a Saudi dissident. He was a Saudi power player. And came to a no good end. Well, that happens. But Biden made a whole to do about it. And so, he's had very poor relations with Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia had good relations with Trump. So it makes sense. You can go among Iran and Saudi Arabia. You take one side or take the other side, but you've got to pick. But if you antagonize both, well, then you get what you've got now, which is a reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Martin, what do you think? This is interesting, isn't it? The Saudis and the Iranians and the Israelis actually starting, because the Saudis have got good relations with both now.
Well, I think by forming a relationship with the Israelis are not very happy about what's happened. But of course, the big player in all of this was the Chinese, because it was all signed off in Beijing. And that, of course, does signpost the future, doesn't it? Because the Chinese have got lots of resources to resolve conflicts. They see that, and their peace plan for the Ukraine, which was dismissed immediately by the Western powers, it was basically saying return to the Minsk agreements, which Germany and France and the UN Security Council said was the way forward back in 2014, 2015.
Saying it all along, haven't
they?
And
of course, we can't go back to that because the Russians, quite rightly, are not prepared to do deals with people who don't stick to deals they've done already. So that's why we can't do anything there.
In my view, this kind of is a bit of a pat on the back for Jeffrey Sachs, saying, well, a lot of this is really about China, because the Chinese are sitting and watching what's going on in Ukraine and the mistakes and blunders made by Biden, and they're cashing in on all of it. But anyway, on the Scott Ritter programme, he does a weekly programme with Judge Napolitano this week, the former US Marine Corps intelligence officer and the weapons inspector in the Iraq war who resigned because he said there were no weapons of mass destruction before the war started, Scott Ritter. He was talking to Judge Napolitano. It'd be good to get your comment after this about what's going on with Taiwan particularly, and generally with China.
To Taiwan. Admiral Paparo, as you know, you probably know him personally, is, I don't know the rank other than 4 stars, but he's in charge of the Pacific Fleet. So he's got a humongous sense of responsibility. Here he is. We have a couple of clips. The first one, she asks him about whether he talks to his Chinese counterpart.
If the U.S. and Chinese militaries can't communicate over a Chinese spy balloon, then what's going to happen when there's a real crisis in the South China Sea or with Taiwan?
We'll hope that they'll answer the phone. Else, we'll do our very best assessment based on the things that they say in open source and based on their behavior to divine their intentions, and we'll act accordingly.
Doesn't that make the situation even more dangerous if U.S. and Chinese militaries are not talking?
Yes.
Okay, before you give us your views on the substance of what he said, should an active duty four-star with tens of thousands of troops under his command and billions of dollars worth of ships under his command be giving an interview to a national news organization on camera like that?
I respect Admiral Papero enough to say that he didn't do that interview without getting it cleared with his with the Pentagon first. Look, he is the combatant commander of one of the most important theaters of operations in the United States. That's Pacific Theater. This is a big deal. He's a big man. He has a lot of power, a lot of influence, and he knows that. He would have been picked for that job if he was somebody who was just bumbling along. He's not the kind of guy that's going to go out and get an interview of this high profile without first clearing it with the Pentagon and indeed the White House, the National Security Council. Every message he gave during this presentation was a message that the White House wanted him to impart on the American public and the Chinese. This was an act of diplomacy that took place here. He is sending a signal to the Chinese, communicating basically his unease at the fact that they're not communicating and trying to let them know that there is some consequences for this failure to communicate.
Is it believable that there's no back channel communications going on between an admiral of this rank and his counterpart in the Chinese Navy? I mean, he's in Guam. The interview takes place in Guam, so he's way out there. It's not like
his headquarters is in Hawaii, actually. Pretty nice headquarters. But so he's just visiting Guam right now. It's not the position of the admiral to have back channel communications. That's beyond his remit. I believe there are back channel communications that are probably going to be run by William Burns, the CIA director, probably operated out of the National Security Council, maybe even from the White House itself, that there are back channel communications, at least attempts to do so. But China's dismissive of the United States altogether. Biden can't get Xi to answer the phone. So if the president of the United States can't get, the Chinese leader to answer the phone, don't be surprised that the commander of the Pacific Fleet can't get his counterpart to answer the phone. Hopefully there's something going on akin to what we saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis where, John F. Kennedy had a back channel opened up with Nikita Khrushchev that was kept out of the limelight. The fact that you and I don't know about it hopefully means that it's happening. It's happening successfully.
Well, I wonder, but I mean, there's a sort of backdrop to that conversation, George, where he's suggesting that the CIA and Burns at the CIA is chatting with the Chinese, but the president can't. I mean, he can't even get President Xi to pick the phone up, apparently.
Well, I mean, the problem for the Biden administration is that it's going out of its way to antagonize China. What it's doing in Taiwan right now is quite similar to what the United States was doing to Ukraine, really, for many years before 2022. They're pursuing what's known as the porcupine strategy, which is, you keep arming and arming and arming Taiwan to the point where it becomes very difficult. It will become very difficult for China to mount any kind of a military offensive against Taiwan. Why would it want to mount a military offensive against Taiwan? Well, China has outlined what is its red line on Taiwan. If Taiwan declares independence, then it will be forced to resort. It would have to resort to force. Now, if you continue to arm it, then it's going to be very difficult for China to do anything about it. So it's kind of similar to what was going on with Ukraine. I mean, you keep arming it and arming it, creating this very hostile state on Russia's borders until it reaches the point when Russia feels this can't go on. Because in no time, this will be a very heavily armed warship with its guns pointed at us. We have to do something about it now. And this may well happen at some point in the near future with Taiwan. And given, we now have the Taiwan president visiting the United States. The Taiwan president will probably meet Kevin McCarthy, who's the number 3 in the pecking order in the United States. And then we had Speaker Pelosi a few months ago visiting Taiwan. So the Americans are really building up Taiwan, and they're sending in their military hardware. So at what point does Xi decide that we can't allow this to continue? So, a Ukraine-style conflict could well be coming in Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that's a definite possibility. I think if you look at the Chinese proposals for the resolution of the Ukraine crisis, they were suggesting going back to the Minsk agreements, which would have allowed the breakaway republics in the East Ukraine to have autonomy, but within a Ukrainian official de jure state. And that, of course, is the solution for Taiwan. If the Taiwanese government accepts that they are de facto part of the Chinese, that they're part of the Chinese setup, but they have independence within that. And at the same time as the president of Taiwan was visiting the United States, the opposition former president from the Kuomintang political party, he's visiting China for the first time since 1949. And he went to the mausoleum of Sun Yat-sen, who's the grandfather of both the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party. And of course, in the past, they were in alliance together against Japanese imperialism. So I think there's going to be an election in Taiwan, not this year, but next year, I believe. And the KMT have done quite well in the local elections. And what their pitch to the Chinese, the population in Taiwan itself is, let's not pick fights with the Chinese. Let's try and find a way to live with them. And of course, their position has always been that they don't want Taiwan to be independent because they see themselves as the legitimate government of the whole of China. Now, all of these things are messy. These things are always messy. Azerbaijan versus Armenia is quite messy, but it's all resolvable if people have got the right attitude. But of course, we've got a belligerent attitude, just knee-jerk belligerence coming out of the Western deep state.
George, I'd love to know what you make of the climate talks, because obviously the Chinese are looking at this and saying, well, hey, this is all aimed at us, really, isn't it? We're the big industrial power in the world, and what you're telling us is that we're going to have to shut all this down.
Well, it's exactly right. And I mean, China takes that view and India takes the view, which is that, you got very rich using fossil fuels, cheap energy, and now you want to prevent us from becoming rich using fossil fuels and cheap energy. You decide that, you've acquired religion and say, oh no, we have to have green, we have to have net zero emissions and so on. So the Chinese say, yeah, this is how you always do everything. You get rich, and then you announce that, yeah, but no one else can get rich using our methods. And this is the way it's always done. It's a little like on the issue of war crimes. The worst war crimes have been committed by the Western powers, but then they get more and more sophisticated military hardware, which enables them to perform more accurate military targeting. And then they say that anybody else who's using less sophisticated hardware are guilty of war crimes because they're causing indiscriminate casualties, the very indiscriminate casualties that the Western powers had themselves done for centuries. So it's always this hypocrisy that you say, no, we've done all this, but now nobody else is right to have it, and we will judge you for for your sins.
Nobody seems to call this out in the Western press at all, bizarrely. I mean, even though I think we could really do with a kind of international comedy programme which points out some of the hypocrisy that's going on and the sycophancy of the press in simply not making the very basic, simple comments like the one you've just made. Anyway, just to wrap up, I'd like to look at the World Economic Forum a bit and also the financial situation. So let's go back to a guest we had earlier on before the break, Heiko Koo. He does the Marxist tours of London on every Sunday, and he also is a regular speaker at Speaker's Corner, as well as he did have a program, Speaker's Corner program on the London radio station Resonance FM, to hear what he has to say about what he thinks is now going on with the World Economic Forum, because he thinks that there is a kind of backlash against it going on at the moment, particularly in Europe.
There are a lot of people who argue that Klaus Schwab and co. are commanding the trajectory of the world. And I think there is an element of that within the dystopian utilization of technology and the advance of key sectors, for example, pharma and AI and tech. On the other side, these are the trajectory is now inverted. I think the COVID pandemic was the peak of globalization. So this was as far as they're going to be able to go in terms of having the world on board to do their bidding. And then the war in Ukraine is the splintering. It's the consequence of that attempt to unify the entire world behind jabs and vaccine passports and segregation. That was the peculiarity of it. So the way in which the unification of the world under Schwab and co. appeared in its ultimate phase was the global splintering of the splintering of the world. The European Union ending up as borders with PCR tests and lockdowns and God knows what, and I think that's the inversion of that is taking place. The inversion of this was the inversion of globalization, the splintering of the world and the division of the world into subsections. Now, the European Union, for example, van der Leyen was talking today, saying about, we need to be wary of China, but the Spanish are out in China. The Germans are making deals with the Chinese. They're no doubt discussing Ukraine with the Chinese. And they've got a lot of interests in common with the Chinese. And if the Americans, there was an article in FT again today, quite a good article, discussing, well, what country can actually isolate itself? And the United States is only the only country that can really just like, look, let's sort them all, we're having nothing more to do with it. And only 25% exports, something dependent on exports. So they can easily deal with that. They've got their own oil and gas. They don't need to worry about the rest of the world if they don't want to. So there is an internal pressure. If Donald Trump or another Republican comes to power, then that pressure will increase. And they don't want to. A lot of Americans don't want to have anything to do with the war in Ukraine. And they don't care if Taiwan is Chinese or not Chinese. And so consequence of that is I think the splintering of the world will be exacerbated even more. The European Union will take a slightly different trajectory and have its own internal crises, a different trajectory to the Americans. And it's a tumultuous world, and it'll continue being a tumultuous world. And the Chinese will continue to grow because the internal structure of the Chinese economy is based on public ownership and planning. And that is a powerful mechanism for developing an economy, particularly in more backward countries like India and much of Africa, who will look to China for investment and for development, both as a model and for resources.
Okay, that's Heiko Koo, and I'll put a full interview up on our show page later this evening at thisweek.org.uk. What do you make of his analysis there, though, George? I mean, he's saying effectively that the COVID pandemic was the peak of globalisation. Now, we're talking now about increasing fracturing.
Well, I don't know, because there was already quite a lot of fracturing even during the COVID era. The relations between Russia and the West continued its downward spiral. I don't think that was in any way affected by COVID. I mean, although they were on the same page, Russia and the West, they all took the pandemic seriously. The Russians, I think, were even the first to come up with I think they were the first to patent a vaccine. But I don't think that affected the geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West. So, and I don't see, to be honest, the United States and Europe going their separate ways. I think they're absolutely locked in for the foreseeable future.
Well, Martin is nodding there, but I'd like to just finish with Catherine Austin-Fitz, if you don't mind, George, giving her take on what she believes is the sort of long-term plan of the banks. I mean, she's very focused on the financial system as a former advisor herself in the US government about finance, and what she's saying here, I think, is that there is a kind of end game that the financial oligarchy is working towards, and she kind of tries to chart it here on the high wire with Del Bigtree last week.
We're in a political process where the people who run the financial system have engineered a financial coup. We should have gotten concerned 20 or 30 years ago, but we've been kicking the can. And now their way of dealing with letting us down, sort of managing our expectations, is to cancel currency and go to a financial system with complete control. So they want to be able to control, they want to be able to turn your money off and on, which they can do in an all-digital system. And what we're now seeing at the state level is real pushback by consumers, by citizens, by state legislators saying, we don't want to be controlled by an all-digital system. There's a huge push to continue to make sure to preserve cash, not just in the United States, but in Europe, because an all-digital system gives ultimately the people who control the central banks and the banking system an ability to literally turn on and off your money if you don't do exactly what they say. And exactly what you say includes taxation without representation, healthcare mandates, and literally taking away your kids.
Well, this is the bigger picture, maybe, George. What do you make of the sort of attempted change to the central bank digital currencies?
Yeah, I think that's the goal, to move towards digital currency. And again, it's very interesting that the sort of supposed leftish parties, the Annalena Baerbocks, they're the ones who are pushing the hardest for an all-digital currency. Sure, there are people who don't want it because it's going to be a disaster. But there will be powerful forces, the banks, the big internet giants, all of the financial interests who want to go down this path of the digital currency. So it'd be kind of interesting. I'm actually quite skeptical whether a cash economy will survive, because there are much more powerful interests pushing for digital currency, and the sort of liberal progressive opinion seems to favor a digital currency.
Martin, it almost seems as if the crises are being deliberately created to create a massive economic crisis, maybe simply a little bit like 2000 in Argentina or the 1990s in Russia, where people are robbed of their savings, etc., if they've got any, and they're in a situation where they will pretty much take any solution, and in which case the financial oligarchy come in and say, all right, you're going to take our electronic money system now.
Well, the implication of what Jeffrey Sachs has been saying about how COVID-19 itself is a bioweapon leak from a US laboratory. He's claiming at the moment this is accidental rather than deliberate. But of course you can see the whole pattern. If it was deliberate, it's a deliberate attempt to sabotage the Chinese economy in the first place, and secondly to create the conditions for this World Economic Forum, Great Reset, digital currency, etc. But of course, what's actually been provoked is the creation of an alternative money system. Sergei Glaziev, who's working for the Russian government, talking to the Chinese about developing commodity currencies, which will be outside the purview of the US dollar. And of course, I still think that, drug gangs in Latin America are going to carry on using cash, whatever they say.
Good point. Anyway, George, I wonder if you could just wind up by letting listeners know where they can follow you, where they can find you, your commentary, etc.
Right. You can find me. I do a podcast with Peter Lavelle. It's on Locals, thegaggle.locals.com. and you can find us also on YouTube, or The Gaggle on the YouTube. I also have my own YouTube channel. You can find me there. You can also find me on Substack, and you can also follow my Twitter feed.
Got any books out in English?
Yeah, my book, Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. Okay, George Samirelli speaking to us live from Budapest in Hungary. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, George. And final item tonight is David Livingstone, the author of Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea. As I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, but there's a little excerpt in here where he talks about these. Well, I mean, it's difficult to know how to describe them exactly, the order of the 9 angles. You might just simply describe them as satanic death squads.
The order of 9 angles openly advocate human sacrifice. What they also advocate is infiltrating all kinds of groups. And so this is what been doing recently. They've been infiltrating a number of fascist groups, neo-fascist terrorist groups. One of them is the Otto Waffen group, which is new. So there's a growing network of international neo-fascist groups, and so this is how one of them is connected with is the Azov battalion that played a key role in the so-called resistance happening in Ukraine. So this is a network now they sort of converge on a forum called the Iron March Forum that was founded recently, I think 2015 or something like that. And Iron March was founded by a follower of Alexander Dugin. So this is where you get the contradiction of Dugin, openly denouncing the Nazi influence in Ukraine, which is very true. But what he is not telling you is that he comes himself from a background of Nazi sympathy with numerous affiliations with Nazi heritage, particularly the Polar heritage, which he openly advocates, and his influence in this growing network of neo-Nazi terrorist groups. Dugin was also affiliated with a guy named Kerry Bolton, and Kerry Bolton is the official distributor of the Order of 9 Angles. So again, this is how they're all connected. So to get back to your friend Nick Land, all these groups advocate a political doctrine known as accelerationism. And that, again, is the idea that they need to accelerate the coming of the end times. And they do so by carrying out acts of terrorism. And
this is human sacrifice for them. It's like a badge of honor.
Yes, they're Satanists. Right? It's hard to wrap your mind around it, but it's hard to understand, if you can put yourself in the mind of Satanists, where killing a child is a positive work, right? Murdering an innocent person is a positive.
How do they justify that to themselves?
I do not know. But that's going back to the same old mystery. There's not one I can explain.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to explain that sort of thing. And we've had, of course, a shooting in Nashville this week. Nashville, Tennessee, with 3 young children shot, dead, by someone who was transgender, although there seemed to be a real great reluctance for particularly the BBC to talk about that in the press. I mean, when you look at the various people who have been involved in these shootings, many of them have had some sort of history of mental health problems. I noticed that the Nashville shooter was under some sort of medical supervision for a psychological problem. David Livingstone's books, there's various of them out there. He's kind of an essential person, really, in that there doesn't seem to be anybody else who's done anything like a brilliant job in actually tracking the networks and the individuals of the occult over the centuries. I mean, literally, right back to things like, the First World War, the Second World War, and the interest groups, including Theosophy, that seem to have so many links to, so for example, the creation of the Nazi Party, creation of the big German nationalist dream of the 1920s and 1930s, that enabled the Second World War to happen and the Nazi Party to take control. So Livingstone's work, I think, is just absolutely top-notch. He's also done this brilliant book, which is a kind of spiritual background to all of it. I mean, I am biased. I find he explains things better than anyone else I've ever come across in this realm, which is the dying God, where he looks at this whole idea of the Canaanite religion, which was spread around by the Phoenicians and people like that, about the sun gods. You know, so the idea was, I mean, basically they were conning people to go and worship the sun. I don't think they even really believed it themselves, but you had to have sacrifices, including child sacrifices to the sun god, and then it was supposed to be a miracle every day when the sun came up again. So that was what many people were kind of conned into believing for thousands of years. By these people. Anyway, time to sign off now. Thanks to our guest, Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, also to sound engineer Dave Bazanko, and to George Samueli over in Hungary. Download our MP3s to listen in the car or anywhere you like. Do please send me interviews, story tips via not the BCfm Politics Show page, where you also find the podcast, full-length interviews, story links, comment page, and our email addresses. You can subscribe to my weekly email list too, unless you're on Google. I'm going to have a good old look at exactly how you can do it if you're in Google. I've sent a letter off to my service provider. Hopefully next week's show on Good Friday will be live, and I can give you a bit of information about, if you're a Gmail user, what you can do in order to get the weekly link, because Google are blocking them. Even if you've subscribed to my channel, they managed to intercept the emails and delete them somehow. Anyway, the show page is thisweek.org.uk. My books are available in print. That is The Siege of Heaven Reader, which is history of secret government from Cromwell to the Princess Diana assassination, and also The Traitors of Arnhem, Martin Bormann and the Bilderbergers. This is a link between the Nazis and the Bilderbergs, and the Battle of Arnhem. So we've been streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokescroft in Bristol on the talkradio.org.uk stream, and at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey. Also on the Not the BCfm Politics Show app. If you can restream us live or rebroadcast us, just let me know and I'll credit you here. Have a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. Do please join us for Not the BCfm Politics Show at 5 o'clock next Friday, Good Friday. God bless, and don't let the Auto Abkeo banksters get you down.